Welcome to the We Stand With Ukraine conference. We'll be discussing historical and current perspectives. We have an amazing list of speakers consisting of politicians, writers, professors, and experts. The conference will last from 1 p.m. to approximately 5 p.m. And we will have 2 coffee breaks in between. We'll kick off the conference with a welcoming speech by Aho Rebas, the president of the Estonian World Council, Oksanen, and a former general inspector of the Estonian Armed Forces. He'll be joined by Karin Karlsbro, a current member of the European Parliament. The floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the conference We Stand With Ukraine. Today, almost the whole world supports Ukraine's fight for its independence and freedom, and so do we here in Sweden. Estonia, among many other states, has experienced the kind of atrocities that Russian regime since 2014 is committing in Ukraine. The Estonian World Council, the main organizer of today's event, was founded in New York in 1954 by Estonians who had been forced to leave their beloved country 10 years earlier because of Russian aggression and terror in a situation similar to Ukraine today. In the Estonian World Council, the biggest Estonian communities and organizations in 12 countries outside Estonia cooperate to preserve our culture, language, and freedom. Our members live in the United States, Canada, Sweden, Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, Finland, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, and last but not least, Russia and Ukraine. And we know that our compatriots suffer from Putin's persecutions and aggression in both Russia and Ukraine. In 1944, the Soviet Russia was ruled by the murderous Joseph Stalin, former ally to Adolf Hitler. And today this pair of brutal dictators is joined by the KGB hooligan and super gangster Vladimir Putin, with his ridiculous pretext that he is just fighting Nazism in Ukraine. Like his predecessors, Putin does not care about neither the welfare or the lives of his fellow countrymen. He treats most other countries as enemies. He eliminates all internal opposition, disinforms his own people, and then sends them to be killed in thousands in senseless wars against peaceful neighbors. Today we will listen to experts explaining why and how this nightmare has come true and what we can expect to happen in the future. I'm sure we can look forward to an interesting conference. We stand with Ukraine. Thank you.
Honorable participants, dear guests. It's an honor and privilege to be here together with all of you today. And I'm very happy to welcome you to Europahuset, the European Parliament's office in Stockholm, as the Parliament is the home for European democracy and meeting point for cross-border discussions. We have an extraordinary program with prominent speakers here today. And I would like to take the opportunity to especially thank the organizers, the Estonian World Council and Association of Estonians in Sweden for the initiative and your hard work for making this conference possible today. The European Parliament has, as we write in the resolution, taken the strongest possible condemned of Russia's illegal, unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against an invasion of Ukraine, as well as the involvement of Belarus in this aggression. We have pushed for tougher sanctions as well as further and more support militarily and humanitarian support to Ukraine. New networks and working groups have been founded, and as always, when it comes to the fight for freedom, my Baltic colleagues are true leaders and frontrunners. Since February, we have been in close contact with our colleagues in Kyiv, from the Verkhovna Rada, of course, and sometimes it's actually on daily basis. Today we are going to focus on historical and current perspectives, but I hope there will be time for future perspectives as well. When Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, addressed the plenary in the beginning of March, she reminded us about something very important. She said, quote, "We shall not forget that Ukraine came under attack in 2014 because it wanted to join the European Union. Ukraine came under attack on February 24th because it seeks to take its rightful place among us." She continued, "It is in our interest that Ukraine becomes more stable, more prosperous, and solidly founded on the rule of law. I know from Estonia, from our own experience, that this is how it works. But it is not only in our interest to grant Ukraine membership perspective, it is our moral duty to do so." Ukraine is fighting not only for Ukraine, they are fighting for Europe. So if not now, then should they be welcomed to the EU, I ask. Freedom, democracy, peace and resilience can't be taken for granted. These values can only be protected, defended and developed together. And democracies must stand together. And we must stand with Ukraine today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Unfortunately, our key speaker, Sofi Oksanen, couldn't be here today due to illness. And the discussion will be led by Aho Rebas, history professor and former Estonian defense minister, and Kragh, the Deputy Director of Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Welcome on stage.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think, first of all, we should send our greetings to Sofi Oksanen. She might be listening to us and looking at us, and we hope you, Sofi, will recover soonly and will be back on the area where you belong and where we need you very much. I want to make a rough start by telling you a story which you might have heard before, but if not, here it comes. It's about the frog and the scorpion. The frog and the scorpion stand by a river. They want to cross it. You know, the frog is a good swimmer. The scorpion is not. Scorpion is begging the frog, "Please take me on your back. Take me across the river. Please do it." The frog says, no, you're the scorpion. You know, I'm afraid of you. No, says the scorpion. Just do it. It will be fine. You know how it ended. The frog took the scorpion on his back and swam across the river. And when they came over, the scorpion struck. "Oh, why did you do this?" "I'm a scorpion. This is my nature." This is a good story to remember in front of what will be coming now. I will start quite roughly by showing you some slides, some pictures. Can we have the first one, a map? You might recognize the structures here. It's the Baltic Sea area, because I'm going to talk about the Baltic Sea area first. This is a situation in 1998. You remember it's the time where Putin starts his career, and Russia is made green here, as you see, and we have the exclave of Kaliningrad, also green, and we have the Belarus, diffusely half green, half not, whatever. And we have the NATO countries painted in red here. And there is a block of white states, not NATO members, in 1990. It's just 25 years ago. We all remember this, but let's take the next one. It goes quick now. January 2022, what do we see? We see Poland has become a NATO state, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania also, and there is a green line running across the Baltic Sea, and this is of course the Nord Stream 1 or 2 and the discussions about it. And you see Russia is still green and Belarus is green too. This was a situation till just a couple of months ago, and then it changed quickly. Can I have the next one? Well, I sketched it on June 2nd, and what do we see here? We see Finland and Sweden as having joined NATO, which they haven't actually yet, but they are on their way very strongly. And if you now imagine being the commander of the armed forces in Kaliningrad, so this is what you will see tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. You will be surrounded by NATO, totally. And behind you, you of course have Kremlin, and you have this man Putin and all that. This is what it will, the Baltic Sea area will look like from a Kaliningrad point of view right now. Have next one, because it's escalating. And now I've sketched the Russian needs strongly underlined, because this is what they want. Because Kaliningrad is needed for the Russian armed forces very strongly, because the northern fleet in the north, you see, the Severomorsk and whatever they are, ships can't be repaired up in the north. They have to come to the Baltic Sea, because it's warmer there, to the dockyards of Kaliningrad. That is to say, the northern fleet, which is a strategic weapon, number one for the Russians, at least it was, and maybe it still is, they have to get a clear passage to the Baltic Sea. And as you see, the passages, the Danish straits, are very red marked on this map. Let's have the next one. So if I'm the commander in Kaliningrad, I clearly sketch these red circles on my map, because these show where I am locked in. They hinder me, they stop me from reaching the oceans, the freedom of the oceans. And you see, the first passage, which will be a problem for the parts of the fleet docked in Petersburg, is the Gulf of Finland. Like in the autumn of 1939, when Finland and Estonia could have blocked the passage into the Finnish Gulf, to Leningrad then, the Finns and the Estonians, both now or in the future, near future, being NATO members, could easily do it again. With batteries in Hankö and in Osmosar in Estonia, it's a piece of cake to do that. This would bother the commander in Kaliningrad. Then if he passes on, he gets out of the Leningrad area, he wants to join his fleet from Kaliningrad, and you see, you have to pass Gotland. And Gotland, in the near future, probably, hopefully I would say, would be a basis for NATO forces. And these NATO forces wouldn't just use handguns. They will put up a strong defense around Gotland and build a cupola to safeguard Sweden and these NATO countries from whatever might come from Kaliningrad or further east. So Gotland will be a total threat for the Kaliningrad commander, especially as the commander knows that the NATO strategists play with scenarios where in a future crisis, Kaliningrad, the threat from Kaliningrad to the west has to be eliminated in one way or other. If you had read the novel by the British General Richard Shirreff, it was published 2016, War on Russia, you would see that the scenario, the NATO scenario in which this novel is based on, it plays very much with the role of Gotland. Well, and then you see, if you want to drive further, you have to pass the Danish and the Swedish sounds, Öresund, Stora Lilla Bält, and they will be totally blocked by the then NATO forces, Denmark and Sweden. That is to say that the parts of the northern Russian fleet that would have come for repairs to Kaliningrad would have great problems to pass the Danish straits and just to reach Kaliningrad. Whatever, if The Russians succeed with their advances to the west. They start out from the Murmansk and the Severomorsk and those bases in the north, and they try to go west. And you see there is a gap between England and between Iceland, which has always been a strategic problem for the Russians, and it still is. And if you have to pass the British Channel, there is a gap too, which is a problem. But these problems for the commander in Kaliningrad and for Putin and his Stavka, or General Gerasimov, who I personally met, by the way, these problems are arising by every day today. Do I have another one? So this would be the Moscow-Kaliningrad perspective, which men and women are dealing with in Kaliningrad and in Moscow and in Petersburg. That is to say that the Kaliningrad forces are locked in, not only locked in this enclave or exclave, and the forces from Kronstadt, from the inner of the Finnish Gulf of Finland, will have great possibilities to get out. Because the Gulf of Finland could be closed at the estuary from Hankö and from Osmosaron. Åland Islands, Finnish or Swedish, will be a general command. The Gulf of Bothnia will be closed, and forces will be stationed on Gotland, certainly, and in the Danish Straits that will not be only of defensive character. Because the commander in Kaliningrad, he will count on that in a case of crisis, Kaliningrad will be attacked. And where from? Gotland, very close. And also, of course, from German and maybe also from Polish harbors and air bases, what we know. But this is a perspective, which I would have if I were in Kaliningrad. But I have my own missiles, of course. I have my own forces in Kaliningrad, but I would have problems to deploy them. There are rockets which would reach Oslo, which would reach the Gulf of Finland, but whatever. But I think Putin every morning wakes up with this map before himself and thinks of what shall I do now? And he's been very low on this topic because he has other problems for the present. But from the point of view of the Baltic area basin, this is what will come up sooner or later. And I think this is a thing we could discuss here. I'm just throwing this into the discussion. Let's see what comes out. See what Martin says about this. Oh.
Well, thank you, Hain. How much time do we have, actually? Okay, doesn't matter.
Do we have a moderator?
They'll stop us.
Maybe we should have one. Yeah, very good.
Okay.
Just
okay. Well, this is an interesting map, and I think it's helpful for our further discussion. I would like your mental map that you can get maybe if you sort of not necessarily close your eyes, but if you try to imagine the map further to the east of this one, there are a few territories that are of course key in Putin's strategic worldview and his vision for the Russian great empire that he wants to resurrect. What does Putin want? He wants to build a strong Russian state the way he sees it, and he defines that as a strong authoritarian rule, preferably headed by himself. He has probably, I think you can say this without exaggeration, he has come to identify his own position with the position of the Russian state and his own regime stability with the stability of the Russian Federation. He sees those as quite identical. But in addition to this, there are two territories that are of primary interest in his worldview. And one of them is Belarus. And for almost 2 years, he was nudging Belarus closer and closer into the Russian sphere of interest. And today, the Russian military, as we have seen, is able to operate militarily in the war with Ukraine through the territory of Belarus. But most importantly, as I already alluded to, the territories of Ukraine is, of course, of fundamental importance. We don't know exactly what his end goal is at the moment. We know that on February 24th, a new chapter in European history was for sure opened. Many people had speculated what the end goal could be. We know now that the end goal is the complete subjugation of the Ukrainian people and the complete overtaking of at least a substantial part of Ukrainian territory. The first plan seems to have been something similar to what they did in Afghanistan in 1979, which tells us that this is a political goal, the war, rather than a military sort of idea in the general staff. But the general staff had probably then the goal of sort of coming up with some sort of a solution to Putin's political goals, which was the subjugation of Ukraine. And they had told him, and they had told themselves and the world, that we have about 500, 600,000 troops. It turns out that they have about 200,000, and it turns out that probably they are reaching a limit there. So they tried to launch this a quick invasion on February 24th, overtaking the Kiev government, they call the fascist junta, and perhaps even then executing or at least imprisoning the political leadership, the democratically elected leaders of Ukraine. The Ukrainian resistance has denied Russia any substantial advances, but they are slowly entrenching themselves in now what looks like a long war of attrition between Russia and Ukraine, primarily around the territories of the east and the south. But I think there are two important dates besides February 24th when we talk about this war in the future, and one is December 15th. That's when the Russian MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sent a letter to their American counterparts, where they demanded where they put forward 3 points they saw as the future pillars of a new European security architecture. And all of them actually connect to the map we are looking at. Because the first demand was that NATO voluntarily withdraws from all the countries that became members of the alliance after the fall of communism. The second demand is that NATO does not accept any new members in the future. So looking at Sweden and Finland there on the map. And thirdly, and most importantly, that Ukraine is substantially made sort of a permanent vassal state of Russia, basically. A far-reaching Finlandization where Russia has a veto over all important Ukrainian political decision-making areas. It was obvious that these demands would not be met by any Western state, and it was therefore obvious by December 15th that we were moving forward towards the point where Russia would escalate, since they had promised they would do that. 3 days before this letter was sent, I think we got an idea about Putin's ideological vision, his worldview, so to speak. He reverted back to some topics that he has been sort of almost obsessing over for the last decade at least. He was given the question by a journalist again about his opinion about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said that, what I regret, he said, is not the loss of communism, of course, or Marxism, Leninism. We don't need those type of ideas anymore. What he said was that what happened in 91 was that we experienced the loss of this 1,000-year-old Russian great power. This Russian state that had emerged from the 10th, 11th century, eventually establishing itself as the Moscow Empire and then the Russian Empire, eventually being replaced by the Soviet Union, which Putin regards, and many people in his circle and like-minded people in Russia regard as this one single stream vision of Russian history that goes all the way from the Middle Ages to 1991, where a great conspiracy happened. And the Western states, together with what he sees as national traitors, he calls them, or fifth columns, conspired to dissolve the Soviet state, so that the Western countries could subjugate Russia and in order to overtake Russia's natural resources and so on and so forth. These are ideas that he has returned to over and over again, and other key players in the sort of Russian elite, such as Nikolai Patrushev and Sergei Shoigu and even Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, has also mentioned similar world has given sort of similar interviews and written similar statements on this. It means that we are in a position, and potentially in the long term, this position will remain unchanged. It's a position where we have basically two different perspectives that cannot at all be reconciled. On the one hand, we have these ideas grounded in the Helsinki Accords of 1975 and the Paris Charter of 1990, where all states agree to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of other states. They agree to respect democracy, human rights, and rule of law as the basic principles of government. On the other hand, we have a political leadership in Russia determined to rewrite these rules because they see them as unfair and unjust. They see them as hostile to Russia's historical interests. And Ukraine is, of course, the key focal area where this battle over these two different non-compatible European security orders will be fought. This is why solidarity with Ukraine means much more than just solidarity with the people of Ukraine. It means solidarity with all the people of Europe and in the international system. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There is, of course, a lot more to say about this topic, especially if we want to go back into history to the Second World War. First of all, the Cold War, of course, then the Second World War, then the time between the wars, the First World War, and back to the Crimean War, and we can go back to Ivan the Terrible, talking about the problems of this area. I don't know if we're going to give a lecture on that, but maybe you would like to ask questions, so we could just snap onto your questions and then try to elaborate from there.
I was just going to ask you if it's time for a Q&A.
Yes.
Oh, sure.
I would like to. Because I have prepared a long lecture, but you don't want to hear it. That's it.
We have a lot of time until our coffee break at 14:10. So if you would like to add something before the Q&A, you have the opportunity now. Otherwise, I'm going to hand out the microphone to people who wish to ask questions.
Dmitry Pasterman, People's Embassy of Belarus in Sweden. On your map that just disappeared, Suwalki corridor of some reason was green. So I just want to assess how vulnerable is Suwalki corridor really, and what role it can play in the future possible warfare.
As far as I know, the corridor is about 30 kilometers wide, not more, and there are roads going across there. And you see it signed marked with green here on this map because it's of strategic importance. It connects the Kaliningrad area, the exclave, with the Belarus, where you have the Russian or Belarusian troops. And it's been of strategic importance for the Russians to keep it and to keep it safe. And of course, the West has also made its own thoughts about it, what should become of it. But this is the nerves that connects by land the Kaliningrad exclave with let's say the post-Soviet bloc of Russia and White Russia. It's of strategic importance, certainly. And all these scenarios, the NATO scenarios, playing with a Third World War or something like that, they always deal with the Suwalki corridor. Maybe the war would even start there, according to certain scenarios. It's important. So, of course, the Russians are trying to keep it with all the forces they will have at disposal. But because if not, the Kaliningrad exclave will be cut off by land from the Belarus and the Russian bloc.
Thank you. We have another question there.
Yes, my name is Evelyn Tamm. I'm Vice President of Estonians in Sweden. And my question, actually, I'm a master student in Uppsala right now, studying Russian in international relations. But my question is about history. And it's interesting because Putin has been writing what is his view. And we have been discussing, like criticizing it. Okay, it's not our view. But now, on the 24th of February, when I was following the news and after, was horrible, and I was really experiencing like the World War II coming back, all the old histories about Estonian occupation, how it was like happening in my time, and it was terrible. I mean, because in our imagination, it somehow was in the back. It was like it's in the past. It's not repeating again. And what is interesting now that we are kind of forced in this the span of history is kind of the Russian greatness, and we're like kind of forced back to the mindset what was there in the 40s. What is our weapon against it? What is our approach to not go along? And what is your comment on that? What is the positive way forward? How can we not go into the Putin's mindset?
It's easy. Showing strength, unity and strength, and calmness. That's it. And not accepting all scenarios like this. That, as you see, they have in the Kaliningrad area, this exclave. They have they're talking about it as if it were a defensive organization there, but it's an offensive. They have rockets or missiles that would reach these Iskanders. It's been questioned how far they would reach, at least beyond Oslo, and with a precision of 50 meters or something like that. And they have marine naval forces, attacking forces. They have air forces, attacking forces. Kaliningrad is not a defensive exclave. It's an offensive exclave. So they are still planning things. And I read in the papers tomorrow that the Kaliningrad military district just launches maneuvers in the Baltic Sea just today. I've been thinking about that. Why have they been so passive about the Baltic Sea and the Kaliningrad exclave? Well, because they have had other things to do in the Ukraine and elsewhere, and of course they always have to think about China and the Pacific Ocean and things what's happening there. They also play a role for the agenda in the Baltic Sea area. That's clear. But it's been very calm in the Baltic Sea area. But today they started maneuvers. And my question has been also, why have the Swedish and Finnish political top persons, prime ministers, been in such a hurry to run to the Brits, to the Germans, and to the Americans to get security försäkring, what's that? Insurances, thank you very much. Very spontaneously, and in a panic, as it seemed to me. Maybe, I thought, we could see parallels here to the beginning of the Second World War, namely when after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August, at the end of August, the Finns and the Swedes were invited to discussions in Moscow, you know. And the result was that the Soviets put up military bases in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but the Finns refused, and they got the Winter War instead of that. That is to say, the Russians, Putin, and the Stavka and the Siloviki around him cannot be cannot be satisfied with this situation, because the Russians, this imperial Russians, and all with their thoughts and knowledge about the greatness of former Russia, Peter the Great, Ivan the Fourth, all that, being pushed back again. They cannot accept it. So I was waiting for some initiative in the Baltic Sea area, and maybe there has been one also, because of the hurry with which Mrs. Anderson and Mrs. Marin ran along together with their foreign ministers to Berlin and invited Johnson and went away to Washington, could mean actually that they may have gotten a discreet proposal by the Russians, exactly as in 1939. Give us, please, military bases on your territory, or. And here, fatal and strategically totally most important is Gotland, the situation. The Russians cannot. If I were commander in Kaliningrad, I would demand from Putin, I don't accept NATO forces on Gotland, with NATO long-reaching areas and missiles and the security cupola which will be built, not over the island, but over the middle part of the Baltic Sea, of course. I wouldn't accept that with my striking forces in Kaliningrad. I would urge Putin, we have to do something. This is not acceptable. question is if Putin has the resources because they are involved in the Ukraine and elsewhere, and he also has to take China and the United States and the Pacific into regard and so on. But the situation here is very volatile. It's dramatic, actually. We don't see very much about it in the papers because the Swedish journalists don't ask questions like this. But today we saw that the Kaliningrad Navy has been moving around in the southeastern corner of the Baltic Sea again. So things are moving here. And maybe the Swedes have gotten this proposal, and the Finns, and that's why they have run so fastly to the Americans, and to the Germans who don't have very much to put up with here, and to the Brits who don't have very much either. So maybe the situation is evolving beyond our knowledge, I suppose. And I fear it, of course.
Yes, Martin, do you have something to add?
Well, I just wanted to return a bit back to your broader question about, history and history repeating itself. And in a way, of course, history politics, the battle over the interpretation of history or the interpretation of the past has become a key pillar of Putin's narrative about Russia and the West. And the way he describes Russia as, experiencing all these sequences of humiliation and being neglected over and over again, and that he sees himself as being as leader of Russia, being responsible for pushing back, not only against, NATO or a Western-led world order, but also against interpretation of the past that he sees as unjust to Russia's interests. And he clearly sees, and they are open about this in their own doctrines, that the interpretation of the past is an element of Russia's security interests. It means that every government official in Russia is officially obliged to adhere to an official interpretation of the past. And when it comes to the Baltic Sea region or the broader sort of Central Eastern European region, we have seen how this has come up. These topics have come up in essays written by Putin on how the World War II started. He blames Poland somewhat sort of counterintuitively for most historians in the world. He has had a lot of different ideas. How do we counter these? Well, of course, you need to continue teaching history and researching history. You need to have an open debate. I belong to the camp that actually regrets the fact that we sometimes in the West also have politicized history. I don't think it's the sort of it's the prerogative of the European Union to define exactly how history should be interpreted. But I agree, however, that it's part of the responsibility of political leaders to show that they are responsible towards history, and they can show this in concrete actions. But that's a different thing. How do we counter Putin's narrative? I think you cannot do that by simply writing a new essay. Boris Johnson cannot write his own essay on World War. Well, he has written actually a book on Churchill, so he could probably write an essay about the history of World War II also. But that's not how he will convince people. You need a narrative. You need a story, and with a strong story, with a strong narrative, a strong sense of belonging, what it means to be European. That is the ultimate defense against ridiculous ideas that aim to reinterpret the past, in order not just to remain reinterpretation of the past, but also to change the future, which is the goal of this. Putin doesn't have any positive agenda. 22 years ago or so, when he came to power, he was talking about modernization, building a strong state, etc., etc. It sounded a bit authoritarian. He was authoritarian. But he wasn't obsessed with the past, the way he became obsessed with the past in the last decade. This is a sort of a qualitative change. And when you heard his speech, on February 24, the only arguments that he could find, that he could give for why Russia would have to invade Ukraine were historical reasons. Yeah. because he doesn't have any reasons, based in international law, based in any evidence that there are violations of, against human rights that he has to interfere or somehow. No, the only things he could come up with were these alleged ideas about Ukraine not existing as a state because blah, blah, blah. In 1922, Lenin wrote a constitution, blah, blah, blah. The Soviet Union collapsed, etc., etc. All of this, these are the only arguments he can have. So that's why it's important to have an idea about who we are, because it gives us that's the ultimate vaccine against this falsification of the past.
We have another question from the other side of the room.
Hello, you can hear me. I'm Markus Kolga. I'm from Canada and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I have a question about a region that Sweden, Canada, and the United States share concerns about. Last summer, the Russian government issued a claim for all of the resources underneath the Arctic Sea. They've been engaging in a rapid militarization of the Arctic region over the past decade. I would very much like to get the Swedish perspective on this clearly growing threat. In Canada, the government has finally started acknowledging, recognizing this threat over the past few months. Certainly the war, Vladimir Putin has helped with this. What's the Swedish perspective on what's happening in the Arctic? Is there any sort of perception of this threat? And if so, what do you think that the Swedish government is doing or should be doing to counter it?
I send a question to you.
No, I send it back.
This is a question way above my pay level. I can't answer that one. I'm only responsible for the Baltic Sea area.
Yeah, me too. I haven't done the work and the research on the Arctic region. I know, however, that one of the few areas where you had any semblance of cooperation until quite recently was in the Arctic Council, where there was cooperation with Russia also. It was one of the forums where, for example, then as members, Sweden, Norway, Canada, and so on, could also have a continuous dialogue with Russia. That group has also now been suspended. Their working activity has been suspended, to my knowledge. So what's happening? Well, I think we can expect a continuation along the sort of line that you identify, that it will be an increasing area of conflict, and now Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine. A lot of their energies and efforts are directed there, but I'm sure that the Arctic area will come back and bounce back as an area of conflict. But I have no idea exactly what the policy of the Swedish government is. And I'm not sure there is a policy of the Swedish government. So even if there was, even if I had more information, I'm not sure it would be of any help.
I guess that was
I think we could be better on
in
this area as Swedish citizens.
And we have another question from the other side of the room. You can stand there and speak. It's fine.
Hello, Juho Lover from Australia. In many countries that are removed from Europe, politicians, governments turn towards the academics for advice and background to understand situations like this. Recently, I watched a speech from a professor from the University of Chicago, whose thoughts were that the West is to blame for some of what happens. Now, I'd like to thank Hain for his diagrams. What this professor said was that we saw a similar situation back in the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was when Russia was moving missiles into Cuba, and America saw that being very close as a threat, and they wouldn't accept it. And that was quite a volatile situation then. He said that this is the same as what Russia sees at the moment with NATO creeping up on them, and Putin is more worried about his own safety. Now, I don't see that as an excuse at all for what's happening. I think there are many more reasons. But I just wonder if that's the line from a lot of notable academics that might be going to more governments in different countries.
Could you please repeat the question?
I'm just wondering about the influence from certain academics on governments around the world.
Yeah.
Well, I think the question was the NATO expansion part of has that been part of the problem in the
yes, that was from a fairly eminent professor in Chicago. So if he's feeding information to the American government, they're seeing, well, Putin's just reacting the way America did back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Of course, Russia sees the expansion of NATO as a threat. And but the expansion of NATO is a democratic process, actually, because NATO doesn't come in by force, but NATO is really invited by governments which are being democratically elected on a parliamentary basis. So it's not a problem formally seen, or at least not from the West. But of course, Putin doesn't want to have anybody opposing to him close to his borders. And what he fears, it's the Smitta, what's that in English?
Contagion.
Where?
Contagious. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
contagion. Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah.
That the ideas of democracy and all that would spread also into Russia, because it was on the way in the Ukraine, and it was almost stopped, and then it got on again in Ukraine, and it's spreading in the direction of Russia too. And of course, he would stop that as fast as he can.
We're having more questions.
I'm Mari Rinkabel. I'm from Washington, D.C. area with the Estonian American National Council. The topic of this session is shared memories of Russian occupation. The United States does not share this memory in terms of being occupied by anyone, actually. As you probably know, the public in America is split, very, very seriously split between what Donald Trump managed to accomplish in terms of views regarding NATO and the need for NATO and so forth, and what President Biden is now trying to achieve in terms of the unity of NATO. My question is, from your perspective, is there a danger that the unity of NATO, which has been shown to date, is in any way, shape, or form possibly danger in terms of splitting? And the reason I'm also asking that is that while the American Congress was absolutely united initially in terms of standing up to the invasion of Ukraine, there is already movement there in the Senate in particular that the Republican Party is moving away from this united stand.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Well, there's a split in U.S. domestic politics to a certain degree. There's also a split in the European Union. There's at least variation in the different approaches that various governments have selected. So you see, at the moment, you see more convergence between, say, the U.S. and the U.K. on the one hand, and Central Eastern European states on the other hand. That's one group. So Poles and the Brits seem to be more sort of in agreement, whereas you have Germany, France, and Italy positioning themselves as a separate bloc that have come out less in direct support for Ukraine in terms of military supplies and so on. So I'm not surprised. I also think there can be further changes over time. If this becomes indeed a drawn-out, very bloody conflict, over time you will see this divergence become greater, probably. I would not be surprised. On the other hand, you also see a certain policy paradox that if you take Germany, for example, as you know, the German government has received a lot of criticism for not delivering a lot of sort of military hardware to Ukraine, even sort of opposing other countries delivering what they want to do. You have had quite strong EU sort of consensus on sanctions that 6 months ago would have been completely unimaginable. If you take the sanctions, the sixth sanctions package against the Russian economy that was implemented 2 days ago, they are of such an extent that they will probably destroy the Russian economic model. I mean, the export of fossil fuels, We know that this is not the future to export oil and gas because the world is moving towards electrification and so on. But the EU has now imposed sanctions together with the US that will basically cut in half at least Russian oil revenues in 1 or 2 years from now. So it's a huge blow. So in this regard, I mean, the West is always a bit paradoxical. They can say one thing, then they do another thing. They can say that they oppose military support, but they can be very supportive of strong economic sanctions, although those are similar to, I mean, that's part of economic warfare. It's a different part of warfare. Missiles can destroy a weapons factory, but if you deny this factory technological goods, you also destroy it because they won't be able to produce anything. So it's a different way of disrupting the Russian military campaign. So as always, the West is actually, Western democracies turn out to be quite unpredictable and ambivalent. And so even though you have, let's call it, an unknown or sort of a known unknown in a candidacy for the new president in 2 years from now in Donald Trump. I mean, we know that anything can happen. And even under Trump, his 4 years, we saw this ambivalence again. He would say one thing, then NATO was reinforced in Eastern Central Europe. He would say that he wanted to be best pals with Putin. He signed into law new sanctions against Russia. So I wouldn't make any harsh, strong predictions about what the West could do. But I think if there's one risk, it's let's call it Ukraine fatigue, and I think we shouldn't rule that out. But for the moment, there seems to be quite strong consensus.
Yes, and before we move on to the next question, Hain would like to add something.
Yeah.
I would just give another input into the discussion and go back to my role as commander of the armed forces in the Kaliningrad Oblast or enclave. If you look at the map again, if I'm commander, I say I am not satisfied with this situation. I will call on Mr. Putin in Kremlin and his whole Stavka and the Siloviki, and I'll tell them it can't go on like this. And I will use the notion of the window of opportunity, which we know in Sweden since a couple of weeks ago, when there was seemed to be a possibility for Sweden and Finland to join NATO. This was a window of opportunity. But now, I, as a commander in Kaliningrad, I also see the window of opportunity closed, that I wouldn't accept this picture with the Danish and Swedish Strait totally closed and with NATO forces advancing in on Gotland and building up the security cupola. But as we know, Sweden and Finland are not yet members of NATO, and there have been arisen problems. Maybe Turkey is playing together with somebody here, who knows. That before things change very fast here in the Baltics area, I would ask Mr. Putin to make a telephone call to Rosenbad in Stockholm. Hello, I want to speak with Mrs. Anderson. I am Vladimir Putin. I have a suggestion. Would you please come to consultations in Moscow with me? Regarding what? Regarding the position of Gotland. Because as a commander in Kaliningrad, I could never accept that NATO would come forward as a spearhead right in my nose on Gotland like that. This has to be avoided. And Putin still has some crackers in his pockets. He could talk to Mrs. Anderson, said, yes, Mrs. Anderson, come to consultations about Gotland, for instance, and about the Danish Straits, or the Baltic approaches, as they're called. We would make our presence, we'll have some presence on Gotland, which suggests to you that we could have the opportunity to build some military bases in Fårösund, in Slite, in wherever. And if Mrs. Anderson will start to stagger and then to be very, very unruly, Mr. Putin could also remind her, thank you, that I still have some crackers in my pockets, and maybe I, by accident, can just drop 2 of those tacticals in the waters before Stockholm. I mean, if you wouldn't like to come to conclusion, because that chance still exists. And now I'll come back to my start with the story about the scorpion. The scorpion might say, we don't I like you, I love you, we are not going to take any countermeasures, so, but he is a Scorpio. Or like Alla Pugacheva put it. Alla Pugacheva, you remember her? You know her? She's like Carola and Lil Babs in tenfold, something popular. She wrote about Putin a month ago, that little rat from Leningrad. How does a little rat from Leningrad or a scorpion act in a situation like this? Putin has been busy in the Ukraine, it's clear, for weeks now, but now he's moving with his Kaliningrad forces in the Baltic Sea area. And if that telephone call would come to Mrs. Anderson, let us have bases on Gotland, just to secure the freedom of Sweden, the economic prosperity, the culture development, and so on. What would Mrs. Anderson say? This could come up. It came up 1939 in a similar situation.
And now I guess it's a good time to have another question here.
Hi, Otto Alpera, Honorary Consul of Estonia in Atlanta, USA. Sweden has defense forces. To what degree has it already fortified Gotland, given your excellent danger analysis? Sweden and Finland joining NATO is very positive, but even on a fast track, it's going to take a while for the agreements to be reached, the forces to be moved, etc. But to what degree is Gotland already secure?
It's not my area.
2 weeks ago, there was big articles in the Swedish newspaper that the Hemvärnet, what's that? The National Guard?
Territorial defense.
Territorial defense would enhance its repetition days on Gotland from 4 days a year till 30 days a year. This was great news. And we're talking now about 500 men, 600 men, home guard. And the military forces, it's not more than a company with some armors, with some, it's building up, but there is not very much in place. And that is a problem.
That's a hell of a window.
That's what I'm saying. This is also the window of opportunity also for Kaliningrad, actually, in the moment, not only for the Swedish and the Finnish governments. And I think the hurry the Swedish and Finnish governments showed running around asking for security guarantees could depend on that maybe there has been some hints in this direction before to these governments. So they were, and this is a parallel to Finland and the Baltic states in the autumn of 1939, when they were called to consultation and didn't have very much own resources to put against it.
Do we have any more questions?
There's one there from
I can
Patrick.
just hand my
Thank you. And I'll jump into the answer of the last question, because I think the size now is an enhanced battalion.
Battalion?
Enhanced battalion, together with the Home Guard. Mm-hmm. And it was a couple of years ago, the Swedish military did a true special operation. They had an ongoing control exercise, and then they moved military staff to Gotland, and they never left, in awaiting more permanent presence. And that was a measure took, I think it was back in 2016, 2017. So it has been a build-up, and I wouldn't say it's light. And we have also seen that, for example, in January, Sweden moved military assets to Gotland when you had Russian amphibious vessels sailing around in the Baltic Sea. So I wouldn't say it's that bad. But the question I would like to put here is about going back to history. And I think history is a key here in understanding what is going on. And we see the debate is pretty much different in countries that have an experience of the Russian Empire and countries that do not. We had the example in the question about that professor from Chicago, and you can see scholars around in the Western world being a part of Russians' information network, talking with Russian tongue, so to speak, in this. But what would you like to see in order to enhance history understanding and so on in countries that do not have the experience of Soviet or Russian Empire. So countries like Sweden, Norway, UK, US. Thank you.
Du är yngre, du får svara på det.
Okay. Sweden has certain experience of empires, and historically, going back a few centuries, Sweden was a small empire, but still. The good old days when the Baltic Sea was a domestic problem for Sweden, not an area for multilateral cooperation. That was an easier time in some ways, and I guess some Swedes regret the passing of those days when the Gulf of Finland, the Nord Stream, all of these debates, Kaliningrad, that would have been Swedish domestic policy-making questions, not a question for defense ministers. But anyhow, I think the teaching of history has been neglected in many countries for a long time. We have seen a paradox in the sense that in many countries history teaching has been on the decline. On the other hand, we see a quite big interest in the public. I mean, there's a big public demand for books on history, and people like to read magazines and so on covering historical topics. And now in times of conflict, we see that there's an even bigger increase in this interest. But where I think we can sharpen our methods is the teaching of comparative history. That Swedish school children are exposed to historical textbooks or themes that are important for Estonian or Latvian or Lithuanian school children or students, and vice versa. I think many people in Sweden would be surprised to learn about the view of Swedish history in Estonia, which can be quite favorable on occasion even. And those perspectives, I think, could enhance our mutual understanding. And then I think on the broader perspective to bring in, of course, teaching of European history as such. I mean, there is a European history, and I think we should enhance the awareness of this. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, we saw a shift in the historiography and in the interpretation of the past. I mean, because we had, in fact, also in what is today's European Union, 30 years ago, there was actually still a quite big divergence of views, because up until the 1990s, the main idea in history textbooks in the West was about the Second World War, for example, was not very dissimilar from the main view in the Soviet history teaching. It's that Hitler was an awful dictator. He started the war in 1939 by attacking Poland, and then et cetera, happened. Of course, in the West, you could teach about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and there was awareness about the secret protocols and so on. But the main narrative was actually quite similar, which meant that when you had new voices that emerged in the 90s, the newly, the new independent states that regained their independence, such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I'm looking here at the map. They had a different history, and we have seen that for 30 years almost, or at least the first 20 years, there was often quite some friction even. It spilled over into policy-making circles over how to interpret the past, because the Estonians were saying, well, look, you talk about Hitler and that's good, but what about this other guy with a mustache who came from Moscow? Shouldn't we talk more about him? And that's an interesting revelation, because it shows that even in democracies, you can have quite sometimes divergent views of the past. And how do you solve that? You solve it through debate. You solve it through open dialogue. And that's how you increase mutual understanding and so forth. And I think that one of the great achievements of Central and Eastern Europeans and historians such as Timothy Snyder and Applebaum, who were sympathetic to this view in the West, what they gave us was a greater understanding of this other history that you had in Central Eastern Europe, the history that was not told because of the Iron Curtain. And I think we need to continue that debate.
Yeah, with greetings to Sofi Oksanen. I mean, if she's actually looking at us.
Well, yes.
Of course.
Well, she should actually sort of do other things because
I think we shouldn't underestimate the role of pictures, of movies and things. They make a strong impression on the minds of people, and maybe one should concentrate on production of films or things like that.
I mean, I should have mentioned Sofi Oksanen's sort of groundbreaking book, Utrensning in Swedish. I don't know the English word. Purge. It just left me completely, shook when I read it.
And movies like In the Crosswinds and other Estonian films, which have come to be much better and much more acceptable also for Western audiences. I think this is the way one should try to change the public mind in the West, or educate the public mind in the West, I would say.
I'm sorry, but unfortunately, we don't have more time for Q&A. But let's give a round of applause for Hain and Martin.
Thank you. Bra jobbat.
Tack så much.
And if you want to attack them with more questions, you're very free to. And now we will have a short coffee break for 30 minutes, and then we'll reintervene. So take a break. Welcome back, everyone. And we're going to start with the next subject on our list. So we will discuss NATO's changing role in Europe. And I'm going to shortly introduce the members of the panel. But luckily, we have a moderator with us. So one in the panel is going to give the word. And first, we have, I'm going to go after that list that you see on the screen. So Gunnar Högmark, the former member of the European and Swedish Parliament. And today, he is the chairman of Stockholm Free World Forum, amongst other things. Judith Goff, who is Her Majesty's Ambassador to Sweden. Marko Mihkelsson, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament. And Alexandra Ivanov, the speechwriter and advisor on European affairs to the leader of the Swedish Moderate Party. And as you can see on the screen, we have two members of the panel who are with us online. These are Björn von Sydow, the current chair member of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences, as well as the Swedish Defence Research Agency, not to mention a former minister and head of the Ministry of Defence, and Dr. Laima Lucia Andrikene, who's the chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Parliament of Lithuania. I'm going to give the words to Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nora. It feels very important to be here today to discuss European security and NATO on this conference. As we all know, during the last decade, Russia has threatened the European democracies and European democracy. On February 24th, they launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and of course preceded by 2014 and Georgia 2008. So the need for Europe to have a strong military capacity and defense is obvious. That's an obvious need. But an important question is, what role does NATO play to this need? So I'm going to ask the entire panel to answer this question and start with Ambassador Goff.
I knew you were going to do that. Sorry, is my microphone on? Is that audible? Yep, okay, good. So thank you very much for having me here today, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak on this subject. And Ukraine is a subject very, very close to my heart, having served as ambassador to Ukraine 2015 to 2019, but I was also ambassador in Georgia prior to that, so this is a part of the world that matters hugely to me. And of course, NATO has a huge role to play in Europe and European security. I'll be a little controversial to start. Rumours of NATO being brain dead are overblown and clearly very wrong in my view, and I think in most countries' views. The fact is that NATO is the most successful alliance in history. It is an alliance based on the desire to defend and to deter. Now, of course, that raises a huge question for countries like Ukraine and Georgia, who are not members of the alliance, but who are enhanced opportunities partners. But for the alliance itself, it is a political and military alliance of great significance, which continues to be the cornerstone of security on our continent. And the United Kingdom is very proud to play a very forward-leaning role in this. So I think for those countries within NATO, it is absolutely fundamental to our security. The United Kingdom is delighted that Sweden and Finland have applied to join NATO. That is a very important move and one that we fully support and welcome. And I'm sure we'll come on to that in the discussion given how current it is. But also we see NATO as a force for the good. And one of my big preoccupations whilst I was in Ukraine was supporting Ukraine as it moved closer towards NATO in delivering the defence reform and the training which we can see have made such a difference since February the 24th. Now that's not to take anything away from Ukrainians themselves, let's be really clear. Ukrainians are fighting this war, they're doing an extraordinary job and they're paying the ultimate sacrifice. And that is extremely hard to witness for anybody. But I think what we see is a NATO that rightly has an open door policy. That is absolutely fundamental. No country outside of NATO should have a veto on any other country wishing to join. That is a sovereign choice. And in 2008 in Bucharest, NATO said Georgia and Ukraine will join NATO. So there's some really important work ahead, and there are some really important discussions ahead. I think the key thing for now is that liberal democracies in the West continue to be united in their support for Ukraine and their sanctioning and pushback against Russia, and NATO has a fundamental role to play in that effort.
Thank you. Gunnar?
Well, I think I just thought about this theory about NATO being brain dead. That is a brain dead theory. And interesting that Macron, who were very much on one side, and Trump on the other side, both happened to get into that rather bizarre idea. I think we could see one thing, a very important testimonial of how what NATO has meant to Europe, and that is what we very much are talking about here, the countries of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. I would like to say that if those three countries hadn't been members of NATO, they would have been under the rule of Moscow since a long time. Maybe because of military invasion, maybe because of military pressure, maybe because of economic pressure, maybe because of political pressure or whatever. No, you wouldn't agree with that.
We will fight.
Yes, I know that you would fight. But still, the risks. We can agree on that.
Sure.
And that is a very obvious sign of what NATO has meant. But that means that NATO has meant the same for Sweden. Maybe not because we're running the same risk, but the instability in our part of the world. For a long time there was a doctrine in Sweden where it was repeated that the non-alignment has served us well. I think it's important that we understand that NATO has served also us very well. That has brought stability to Europe, and it is that stability that has kept the peace in our region, in our part of the world. And now the reality has not changed. I mean, a war broke out, and that's a change of reality. But what really happened was that reality came so close to us, so that we had to take a decision. And I must say, of obvious reason, I welcome that very much.
Thank you. Marco Mikkelsen?
Yeah, absolutely, Gunnar. I agree with this point of view that NATO made our security and defense much stronger and bolstered it and kept those possible risks in distance. But I was yesterday in NATO's headquarters in Brussels, and I must say that the health of NATO is very good. and especially, of course, after your decision and Finnish decision as well, that shows that NATO is getting stronger, NATO is relevant, NATO's role is understood by people, not only by governments, and we have to work together closely today to keep the unity. This is something what is a very big test prior to Madrid summit at the end of June, and unity when it's also it is in connection with Sweden as well when we think about current diplomatic exercise with Turkey, but also unity what is connected with this barbaric aggression of Russia against Ukraine, because we see already that in some certain capitals there is a fatigue of this war, and kind of ideas are floating at how to end this prematurely or so. So it's, but luckily, as was mentioned, we are 30 allies, soon 32 allies, who are equal in terms to put together strategy and to fight for or defend first and foremost our alliance, and this is most successful alliance ever built, and this is an absolute cornerstone of not only European security architecture but also Euro-Atlantic security architecture. 2 days ago I was in Dublin and had a very interesting opportunity to be part of security debate, which is just getting ground there. As we know, Ireland, as non-aligned country, has kept these kind of topics away from political debates, but two significant changes, the 24th of February and decision of Finland and Sweden to join NATO, has pushed them as well to more seriously to look at the current stage of their defense capabilities. They will invest more into defense, and they are more open to discuss and debate what partners in the European Union, but also in cooperation with NATO, can do better to safeguard all of us.
Thank you. Then I leave the floor to Björn von Sydow.
Thank you very much. I would very much like to concur with the previous speakers, but I would like also to discuss United States of America. And the China question has been dominant back, I think, before even Obama administration. And it is still, with the present administration, a huge challenge. And so bipartisan view, both parties have a long-range vision that China is the fundamental challenger to United States, being perhaps not on military issues, but on many others. Then Mr. Trump was mentioned, I think, by Gunnar. And the good thing is that he has not been extremely successful in the primaries so far. Still, I think we must really be aware of that Mr. Trump can be re-elected in 2025. And reading him, he would probably not have handled the challenge with the Russian invasion to Ukraine in the same way as Mr. Biden did. I don't know the details, of course, but we must discuss he might not have taken Mr. Biden's positions. And these two challenges, China and Mr. Trump, we must address ourselves. And to my view, give preponderance for NATO in military affairs, but try to take up other business in the same matter within the European Union. However, that's a problem. United Kingdom is not a member and of importance. So it is not easy. And I would wind up saying that I hope indeed that we should be able to have encouraged Nordic-Baltic 8 and be influential in both organizations, and we're very much of the same view as has been expressed by Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian statespeople. So that is an enormous challenge for us, and small countries can do quite much if we go together. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Laima Lucia Andrikiene.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Vilnius. Unfortunately, history is repeating itself. Russia, which considers itself to be the successor of the Soviet Union, threatens to implement Putin's imperialist visions of the Russian world in Ukraine. That is clear. So back in 2008 and 2014, developments in Georgia, east of Ukraine, and Crimea clearly demonstrated that Russia had aggressive intentions. But not everyone understood this at the same time. The unprovoked war with Ukraine, which began on the 24th of February, has put an end to any misgivings the world might have had in the past by clearly showing that the Russian regime is likely to start a global war with its neighbors at any time, despite the huge losses on the battlefield and sanctions that hold back the country's economy. Today, we have 100 days of Putin's war with Ukraine. However, it is clear that he has bigger plans, such as destroying the entire Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Let's do not forget that NATO has also received Russia's demands and ultimatums with clear references to the Baltic region. So I would like to finish my very first introductory remarks at this conference that is our understanding is that it is why today is the time for NATO to change. The security context demands a fundamental reset of NATO's deterrence and defense arrangements.
Thank you. I would like to pick up on what a few of you mentioned when it comes to a EU defense. This is something which is frequently debated in Brussels, and there is also certain plans rolled out for it. How should we view this when it comes to its complementary role to NATO, or how so? Any takers? Will there be EU defense?
I think to some extent there is some EU defense, but not very much, and it will never be, because the real backbone of the European defense is and will be NATO. And so even more with Sweden and Finland getting members, not because that we are making that difference, but because of that will mean that there is no other alternative. It is not today either, but it has been some sort of political prospect sometimes for some people. And I think that was the rationality behind what Macron said about NATO once upon a time. But what I think is that the levels above the military defense, we will be better and better to develop what we must be able to do. And that has to do with defense industry, increasing the competence. And I think we should do it together with UK. From Swedish perspective, this is quite natural because the Swedish defense industry is very close to British defense industry. But also what we can today say, the grey zone. The grey zone has previously been a way of describing the turnover from peace to war. What I would like to say is that today we have an ongoing war in the grey zone. And that requires, in the top, military defense, because otherwise you can't object and retaliate against the actor who is attacking you with cyber attacks, for example, or attacking with all other means. You need to have that because otherwise you will be threatened. And I think that will be a logic for the Irish to become members. Because in the time we are now living, the more digital we are, the less territorial we are. Not meaning that territories are not important, but Ireland, who has always been seen as a country not in the front line, is in reality just as much in the front line as we all are in the world we are living today. So I think that European Union needs to do a lot of things, not in a way to compensate or to replace NATO, the other way around. Because I think we shall make the European leg of NATO stronger. And just referring to the Trump issue, the stronger the European leg of NATO is, the better interest there will be from US to keep up the transatlantic link. Because what Trump said very often was that if the Europeans can't do anything, why should we do it for them? The more we are doing things, the less opportunity for those sorts of agitation there will be.
It's very interesting with the UK perspective on this. Ambassador Goff?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a new question. I can remember when I was a baby diplomat way back in the Dark Ages. This was one of the first questions that I had to grapple with when I was thrust into security policy. And I think the same points that we were making then are relevant now. The European Union does a lot of things extremely well, and it does have a role to play in defence and security. But what is the value in duplicating the structures that we already have in NATO that work and are fundamentally proven and really effective, at a time when we all have scarce resources? And, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I think the idea that we will see the European Union stepping into a space that NATO vacates doesn't work for me. Not least because in NATO you have one of the leading nations, the United Kingdom, but you also have the US and Canada, and that's vitally important. And if you want to look at the countries that have stepped up to support Ukraine, you'll find a number of those are in NATO but not in the European Union, and I think that's also vitally important to remember. Now, going forwards, I think there will always be a discussion. In terms of the US question, I think it's always worth bearing in mind that the US has, over time, had benefit from NATO. The only time that Article 5 has been invoked has been by the United States, and NATO came to the aid of the United States. And that's a really important argument to remember. And for all the rhetoric during the previous administration, there was actually still an ongoing commitment to NATO. And of course, it's vital that all European nations step up. And I am sure as Finland and Sweden join, they will do so. But of course, don't forget there are some other formations out there. One of the formations that we lead, the United Kingdom, the Joint Expeditionary Force, that is UK-led. It is 10 nations, the 5 Nordics, the 3 Baltics, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. That's not in competition with anything that the European Union does or that NATO does. It's meant to be complementary. It's had a huge benefit while Sweden and Finland have been outside of NATO to allow that joint exercising and those nations to come together with a focus on the Baltic and the Nordic area. So there is space for complementarity. And I think we will see that continue because we have nations who are like-minded. So as Sweden and Finland join NATO, I think there will be very, very strong partners, very strong, like-minded, capable partners, and that will both bolster the alliance further.
How should we view Europe's role in NATO? Many of you have mentioned United States, but how should we view Europe's role? Mikkelsen?
Very easy. All those major challenges actually are on our borders, the European nations' borders. But I see EU's role as keeping political stability and coherence on a European continent. And as we see, there are countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, who have a great desire. I mean, people have great desire to become members of EU. There are a lot of benefits, and we Estonians know firsthand how it helped for us to transform our nation during the last 30 years. And this is what should apply for also for Ukrainians, Georgian, Moldovans. So I'm very much looking forward that EU member states, including Sweden, I heard that Sweden has a little bit more critical position on that, but I hope that government will change that. During European Council meeting in midsummer days, we will be able strongly support, unitedly support Ukrainian will to become a candidate country within EU. And just in March, EU adopted its first strategic document, let's say, in a way, exercise strategic compass, which is a very positive step towards building more strategic culture and thinking among EU member states as well, helping countries like Ireland to be more connected to these kind of these debates, but also it argues very specifically that we should not duplicate what we do within NATO. NATO is a defense alliance. EU will never be defense alliance. And this is how it should be understood. And also we have to build very strong transatlantic, or keep and build on strong transatlantic links. And if I may, just 2 words about this, what Mr. von Sydow said about US and elections in 2024, I'm not afraid at all. US still is democracy, yes, with deficiencies, but who doesn't have? In Estonia, we don't have government from today on, or at least we have a minority government for a couple of days. So we'll see what will happen.
That's what we in Sweden call European crisis.
But this is democracy. You know, this is vibrant life we have in politics. But about China, I think China is right now very closely following what's happening in Ukraine and how we as Western allies stand against this might to change the borders by force, what Russia would like to achieve. And this has a critical importance when you think about the future of Taiwan and the stability in the East Asia as well. So it has critical role, and this is why I think both current administration or future administrations value very much being a member of this alliance.
As everyone knows, Sweden and Finland is applying for membership, but an even more hot topic is, of course, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. How should NATO handle the relationship with these 3 states? Should it be open for membership? Yes. Mr. von Sydow, perhaps?
Yes. Yeah, basically, I think so. It is as a position of principle, yes. However, I think that an intensified collaboration within the Council of Europe would be very much of value. The Council of Europe is, as you know, focused on democracy, rule of human rights, etc. And they also, I think, bring up transparency. So these countries, I think, should be very eager to address themselves to collaborate, for instance, directly with the Council of Europe, but also with the political forces and democracies, in order to achieve more legitimacy. And the same goes with the countries in former Yugoslavia, which also ask for membership in the European Union. But it is, of course, a challenge if one cannot predict what will be the internal decision-making relating, for instance, neutrality on between different competitors and not allowing any sort of modern corruption and etc. And there has also to be discussed social media. So my overall reply to the question is be even stronger on democracy.
What would be the Lithuanian perspective on this, Dr. Andrikene?
Very briefly, could we imagine what Lithuania and the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea would look like today had we not joined NATO and the European Union in 2004? Instead of the three successful states contributing to economic growth and NATO's missions, it is very likely that today we would be another gray zone with all the consequences arising from it. So to your previous questions on Europe's role in NATO and briefly on Ukraine, looking from our perspective, NATO's open door policy has to strengthen the alliance. So that is why our position is crystal clear. We are in favor of Finland's and Sweden's membership in NATO. We already adopted a resolution in our parliament unanimously saying that you were missed in NATO. Because looking from our perspective, your membership in NATO, it will be a remarkable contribution to the security situation of the Baltic states and the Baltic Sea region as the whole. It is an important step in the face of the long-term threat posed by Russia. What we expect from Madrid summit, we have really many expectations. So a number one priority in Madrid for us is the decision on significant strengthening of NATO's deterrence and defense posture on the eastern flank. And we are really actively working on this. We would like to achieve this goal. On Ukraine. Ukraine must be addressed separately at the Madrid summit. So leaders, they should also send a strong message of perseverance and resolve to continue supporting Ukraine. We cannot speak about war fatigue. And even if it exists, it should not lead to an appeasement policy. We must never forget that Ukrainians are fighting for our freedom and our values. And there is no need to remind the audience of this conference about the Bucharest NATO summit and decisions taken there. So even the slightest illusion of previous statements would send the wrong signals and would be exploited by Kremlin's propaganda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Gunnar Hökmark?
I think one way of answering your question is to be a little bit contrafactual. And let's say that if Ukraine and Moldova had been members of European Union and NATO, then the situation in Europe would have been very different. I don't think that there had been a war by Russia in Ukraine. Russia hadn't been more threatened by this because no one threatens Russia. Well, that's not right. Democracy threatens Putin, but that's another way around. So I think, of course, we need to extend the membership opportunity, and I think it's very important that we are requiring that all rules are applied. But maybe we can do that in a longer time perspective when we are in a time of war in Europe than when we are in a time of peace. I belong to those in European Parliament that pushed through that we accepted the membership of Romania and Bulgaria. And I think it's fair to say that they were not really ready at that time. And we have seen afterwards they were not. But the alternative, that they had been exposed to Russian power policy and maybe the same development as we have seen in Ukraine, would have been much worse for these countries, but also for Europe and European peace. So I think we need to be dynamic, and I don't mean flexible. I mean dynamic in the meaning of how do we secure that the rules for becoming a member can be fulfilled. And maybe we can do it in a number of different ways. The European Union is a magic union because it has always the opportunity to find new ways to solve all problems.
A bit of a sensitive question, but very important is, I think many citizens of Europe are thinking about. How should NATO handle the nuclear threat, which is posed, or at least said, by the Putin regime? Do we have any?
I think in the way that NATO always has handled the nuclear threat from other countries. The fact is, NATO is a nuclear alliance. That is its fundamental underlying defence. At the end of the day, you have the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. And for as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will be a nuclear alliance. And I don't see the change, really. It's very, very clear. If you look at NATO's doctrine, it's about being very, very clear that we want to deter, and that's the key point. These weapons are not meant to be used. They are meant to be there to deter, and they are meant to say to an adversary, if you attack us to a certain level, then we have the resolve and the capability to inflict a significant cost upon you. Now, we never want to use these things. Let's be very, very clear. But I don't think that policy changes. And so again, what we're talking about is NATO deterring Russia or any other adversary from using those weapons.
I realized as I said the question that maybe this was a very Swedish question. This is what we have been debating and discussing for a few months and years. Our last questions from us, and then we're going to open up for a Q&A. So I just want to ask the entire panel to be brief. But when it comes to NATO's role in Europe in the future, how is that? How do you see it? And this time I will start with Mr. Björn von Sydow.
Thank you very much. And basically, I foresee and predict that NATO will have this sort of role as demonstrated these days and months. And also referring to what the ambassador told us about the UK nuclear policies. And I hope that NATO will be able to find a good cooperation between the European structures in itself, or, sorry.
The train is arriving.
Yes, it's a train, definitely.
You've got a train set in there, haven't you, Björn? It's running around.
Playing all the time.
I'm a fanatic on trains. Yes, I am. I have no. I'm Mr. Trump. Yes, could make NATO different, but the UK is a member of the alliance, and hereby we also have France, Germany, and UK as collaborators, which cannot be easily reached within the European Union as things are standing in the UK, if I understand. So basically, I think that, and one should also keep on not juridifying NATO as much as the European Union is. It's very much of a juridical institution where you all the time have to find out the legal basis for any action or inaction. And that's fine for the European Union and for the democracies. But when it comes to the military defense versus Russia as it goes into an uncontrolled and unbalanced political power, I think it's good for NATO to be in the constitutional way it was formed and still is.
Thank you. Dr. Andrikene?
Thank you. Again, very briefly, I already said at the beginning that today is the time for NATO to change. What I mean, first of all, that allied territories and populations must be defended from the first minutes of the aggression, rather than liberated afterwards. We see, what's going on in Ukraine. We see all those damages and atrocities committed by the Russian army. And, being in Vilnius now and knowing our security situation, I could imagine how this liberation would look like. So no NATO state should become yet another Bucha, Irpin, or Mariupol, and the alliance simply should be fully prepared for rapid collective defense in the event of the aggression. Sadly, de facto situation, NATO's current tripwire portion in our region is not sufficient to prevent Russia's aggression. In order to ensure that deterrence by denial, NATO should move to modern forward defense. And we keep repeating this message now. We simply are very open about this. We said that we left strategy of deterrence already, it's in the past. And we are to implement a new strategy for more modern forward defense. And our logic is very simple. Liberating the NATO territory after a Russian invasion would be much more costly. Finally, if we have some time, I will add something on China, because I think it's also a very important topic. And there we should speak about NATO-EU cooperation and deepening of our ties with Asia-Pacific region. But that is possibly later. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marko Mikkelson?
Yes, as I already mentioned, I see future very positively, and I'm very optimistic that NATO is going to play a crucial, important role, keep us all safe, because we don't have any other alternative. Last October, I remember we visited London and had a meeting with our Westminster colleagues, and they were quite unhappy after Afghanistan, and there was up even question, what is the purpose of NATO now after Afghanistan? And half a year later, nobody, or even a little bit more than half a year later, nobody asked about this. Do we need NATO or not? And those words, what both Trump or Macron or somebody else used in the past, they are not just relevant. NATO has proved its relevance, as I said, but what is going to be very, very crucial is going to be how will end Russia's war against not only Ukraine. To be honest, they are really telling all of us that they are in the war against us, our world order, our security architecture here in Europe. So I see that there could be only two possible solutions. Either we will win and Russia is strategically defeated, end of the day, or Ukraine will suffer heavy losses, Russia prevail, and we will strategically defeat it. That doesn't mean that NATO will collapse or so, which of course is one of the key priorities of Russia, as we saw, and what Martin Kragh just reminded us earlier on, that what was written in their ultimatums in December last year. But I very much hope that today we have strong enough political leaders to carry on and to really fight for the better future, because we shouldn't stop in a way and hope that some sort of peace or ceasefire will solve our problems. We have to end this regime in Russia.
Thank you. Mr. Gunnar Hökmark?
We Swedes are world champions in overestimating our own importance. Our Finnish friends are a little bit different, so on average we are quite normal. I say this because very often we say that 1 + 1 gives 3. I think when Sweden and Finland enters NATO in our part of Europe, 2 plus 3 plus 3, the free Nordic and the free Baltic, will mean 10. And that is not because of our importance, it is because of the system as such. The free zones, as they have been mentioned, will not be there anymore. There will be a stronger, better, more stable containment in a modern term, in a modern way. And I think this is making Europe as such much more stable. But it means something else, because this means also that the European leg of NATO will also give a constructive way of how to develop European Union. And if I link that to the discussion about strategic autonomy and strategic sovereignty, which I has always been suspicious of, because they are code words for protectionism and a negative approach to the transatlantic cooperation, we have seen now that what we need is strategic capacity, strategic capability, and strategic alliances. What has happened in Europe regarding Ukraine wouldn't have been possible without US and without UK. And that has mobilized all of us. So I think another way of answering your question, what will be the role for NATO? Well, I think NATO is showing that the European leg of NATO will be able to stand up on your own, but not walk alone. And that's a huge difference in thinking. That is not the Macron thinking, but that is, I think, a Nordic thinking. And then we're coming back to the 2 plus 3 plus 3 thinking, which is very close to the UK thinking, which we have lost in European Union. But then we can regain UK by us. That's a fantastic equation.
Thank you.
And then we will try to have you as close as possible anyway.
I mean, to return to my earlier metaphor, NATO is very much alive and kicking and will continue to be so now. On Wednesday night, I spent the night with over 200 sailors. That's a confession. But I was on HMS Defender coming into Stockholm through the archipelago. That's one of our Type 45 destroyers. Why do I boast about this? A, because it's a fantastic ship. But also, the reason that HMS Defender is coming into Stockholm and is now here is because NATO Bulltops is happening this week. That's over 50 ships coming into Stockholm, going out again and exercising in the Baltic Sea. It's the first time that Sweden has hosted this, and we're delighted that Sweden is doing so. That's a huge demonstration of commitment from the alliance and the nations of the alliance, if you think about it, and what that entails. So I think, let's be really clear, that practical demonstration where NATO and NATO allies are leaning into the region shows you just how vital this alliance is and just how much it is doing. So in very short sentence, NATO will remain vital and enduring.
Thank you. So now we have time for a few questions from the floor. Do we have any interest in that? Some follow-up questions? Well, I have a lot of follow-up questions.
You've got one there.
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. So please just introduce yourself and state your question.
Yes, I'm Alex. I'm from Switzerland, and you were talking a lot about new countries joining NATO, and that NATO should always be open to membership to new members. How do you evaluate the risk of new conflicts evolving between countries in the NATO, for example, Greece and Turkey, and what do you think should be NATO's strategy on handling it, or such conflicts?
Thank you. Gunnar Hökmark, do you have some?
I think without NATO, the conflict between Greece and Turkey would have been much more intense and much more open. Now it has been contained in the structure, in the framework. But the Greece and the Turks has a lot to do with each other. Nowadays we have to do a lot with the Turks as well, which is very unfair because Sweden is in Turkey named as Turkey's oldest friend, and we have always been helping them. What are they doing now? We have to overcome this, of course. But to answer your question, I think that in that sense, an ambassador can answer that better, but NATO has proven also to keep countries together, even if they have conflicting ideas. In contrast to the Warsaw Pact. Martin Kragh, who was here earlier, he has a fantastic formulation in his book about the Warsaw Pact. That is the only defense alliance that has invaded each other.
Yes. Well, then I would like to say a big thank you to this very distinguished panel. And I got a lot of... we have a last question up here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Dmitry Wasserman. I'm representing People's Embassy of Belarus, representing people, not the regime. If we continue on the Turkey side, NATO is alliance built on common values, and you all in the panel know about human rights situation in Turkey and their regional ambitions as well. So is there any contingency plan for the situation if one member stops sharing our common values and common vision? Can NATO be paralyzed in this case? And is there any way to prevent such situation in theory? Because I don't know if we can be sure if Turkey in all situations will protect their alliance, or maybe we do, if the Article 5 is invoked.
Very difficult question, and I would like to perhaps Mr. Mikkelsen could give your perspective.
Who said that life must be easy one?
No Estonian.
So it's a challenge, yes, of course. It's a very, very good question, you know, in one way, what we see on a practical level, what Turkey is doing as ally. I think that there are even nowadays many of very good and positive steps what they have done, including also using Montreux Convention right now, keeping Russian ships. More than 40 ships are waiting to get through Bosphorus to the Black Sea. There are pluses, there are minuses. You know, within the EU we have also quite interesting debate about Hungary, let's say, recently. But you know, it's we have to focus on the bright side here and try to use our sort of diplomatic skills and strategic vision in a way to keep alliance together, which doesn't, of course, guarantee that one day we have to make decisions, or maybe a little bit more painful decisions. But so far, I don't see that we have reached sort of critical point yet.
Perhaps just to add to that, you know, the alliance has come under strain in the past. If you go back to the last Iraq war, that put huge strain in relationships, particularly between the United States, sorry, it wasn't us, well, not strictly speaking, but the United States and some European states. You know, that was a real challenge at the time. If you look back to some of the rhetoric and some of the real diversion, but the alliance held together. Why? Because I think everybody sees the value of the alliance, and so we will always have discussions and differences. I think that's absolutely clear, but the strength then comes in unity and diplomacy and ensuring that we are able to have those discussions and take the work forwards. And I think, you know, what we have seen over time is that the alliance is pretty resilient.
Well, this was a lot of new perspectives on NATO and a lot of insight, so a big applause for this panel. And then we're going to move to a coffee break and be back in about half an hour. Thank you.
Welcome back. The next topic is the information wars across the globe. And this discussion will be held by Markus Kolga, the founder and director of Disinfowatch. He's a journalist, filmmaker, a digital communications developer, and fun fact, he was also named named on the Kremlin's sanctions blacklist in March 2020.
Oh, thanks, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
We have Patrik Oksanen, a Swedish award-winning journalist, writer, and security expert, a member of Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences, as well as the Royal Swedish Societies of Naval Sciences. And then we also have Hanna Lupakova, who is a journalist and non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, published in, amongst other, in The Economist and Washington Post. She has been a correspondent for the only independent Belarusian channel. I'm going to hand over the microphone or the word to Markus Kolga, who's going to make a short introduction before we start the discussion. And not to forget anyone, on video we should have Jessica Aro, who is a Finnish journalist working for Finland's public service broadcast, and is also the author of the non-fiction book Putin's Trolls, as she has investigated pro-Russian internet trolls.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Nora, and hello to all of you. It's great to see most of you in person. Jessica I saw about a month and a half ago in Ottawa, so I saw her in person. It's great to be with you. We've seen each other virtually several times over the past 2 years, so thanks so much for being here. I want to thank the organizers of this amazing conference, Sidle Söt, who has worked tirelessly for the past several weeks to pull this together. Thank you so much, Sidle. Ret Martin Ser and Evelyn Dum, you've done a terrific job, and to the Roti Eslasteli, thank you so much. I want to also say congratulations and welcome to Sweden for joining NATO. Just this morning, I saw our Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweet that Parliament yesterday, although Parliament doesn't need to ratify Finland's and Sweden's membership, there was a motion in the House of Commons and it was unanimously adopted to welcome Sweden and Finland into NATO. So please welcome Sweden.
And Finland.
And Finland, of course, yes. Finland, yes, both. Now, before we begin, I want to give you a bit of a high-level overview of the intensification of Russian information and cognitive warfare over the past few years, and more specifically in the context of the Baltic nations and our neighbors, to set the stage for this top-flight panel our organizers have brought together here today. The information warfare that Vladimir Putin and his fellow authoritarians around the world engage in is an assault intended to undermine and destroy the core values that underpin our democracy. It's intended to tear apart the fabric of our society by eroding the trust that binds our democratic societies together. We have to remember that the Russian and Belarusian information warfare that we're seeing today is not in any way new, nor is it simply limited to election interference or the war in Ukraine. The intensification of Russian information operations has in fact been building up over the past 2 decades. Domestically, Putin's information warfare against his own people is intended to consolidate his power and extend his term indefinitely. Putin has effectively sealed off his people from the facts and from the truth and from the outside world, and controls all information inside his own country. He's created an alternative sort of Orwellian reality, not unlike the one that he terrified us with in 1984, one in which, quote, war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. In the Western world, Russian propagandists have become adept at identifying and exploiting the most polarizing issues in our societies. They legitimize extremists who advance hate and conspiracies. The Russian troll factories that Jessica has exposed amplify those narratives on both the far left and on the far right. Earlier this year in Canada, during anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination protests that paralyzed Ottawa, we witnessed Russian state media channel RT providing a platform for fringe elements who called for the overthrow of Canada's democratically elected government. It is no coincidence that many of the groups that organized and promoted COVID anti-lockdown protests suddenly started advancing Kremlin narratives about Ukraine on the night of February 24th, including those intended to erode Western support for Ukraine and dehumanize the Ukrainian people. The effort to dehumanize, marginalize, and silence nations once occupied by the Soviet Union is nothing new to Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. The refugees who fled Soviet terror to Sweden and other nations after World War II were branded as fascists for fleeing the Soviet liberation, the same kind of liberation that we're seeing in Ukraine today. Those who resisted Soviet occupation were and continue to be accused of being Nazi collaborators by the Kremlin. Similarly, those in the West who criticized the Soviet regime and advocated for the freedom of the nations held captive by the Soviets were also targets of Moscow's information warfare. This tactic was aggressively redeployed by the Putin regime after the Tallinn Bronze Soldier riots in the context of Estonian history, and it's been accompanied by the Kremlin's wholesale rewriting of history and the whitewashing of Soviet crimes. Those Ukrainians, Balts, and others who criticize Putin today are crudely branded with the same label. Putin has used the same absurd false narrative to, of course, justify his invasion of Ukraine. And yet sometimes this tactic works. In 1991, I personally faced a well-organized intimidation campaign by Putin's Canadian proxies for my advocacy for Magnitsky sanctions and for my work exposing Russian influence in operations in Canada. A columnist at a large Canadian newspaper accused me of being a Nazi whitewasher when I exposed these Russian tactics in Canadian media. This put me in proud league with Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who was accused of the same, attacked for her grandfather, who is a newspaper editor in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. My experience in 2019 ended with death threats against me and my family, which only ended when law enforcement intervened. Everyone on this panel today is intimately familiar with such intimidation campaigns. They've all faced the same sort of threats due to their heroic work to protect our democracies and fight back against tyrants like Putin and Lukashenko, who seek to destroy it. The Russian information war will continue, it will intensify, and it will only get worse. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll hear from some of the most experienced experts in this field who are working on the front lines of information war, exposing Putin's operations and protecting the truth and facts. We'll hear about how Putin exploits our weaknesses, how we can support democratic resiliency, and fight back against Putin and his autocratic allies. I'm going to call on my friend Jessica Aro, who's in Helsinki, I believe, right? To start us off with her opening remarks. And we'll go through everyone else, and then we'll go through a bit of a discussion, and then we'll get your questions from the floor. Jessica?
Thank you so much for this opening. You really got me the chills when you were describing the campaign against yourself, and thank you also for organizing this. I'm really happy to bring my insight and experience to you. This time actually from Bratislava, Slovakia, where there is the Global Security Conference, where we were just hearing, for example, Volodymyr Zelensky just yesterday addressing us distantly. But yes, I want to address Russian trolls as well as their intimidation techniques, as well as their impact and how they portray a serious security threat against us all. So I started to investigate this topic back in 2014, and then I had learned that really brave Russian independent journalists had uncovered the troll factory not far from Helsinki, and in that factory there were people who were being paid to present opinions as if they were real people, when in fact they were paid to fill the social media sphere with anonymous and fake profiles, for example, praising Putin's policies. And fast forward, I investigated that in cooperation with Finnish internet users, and found out, astonishingly, already back then, 2014, 2015, the Russian trolls were seriously spreading the hate speech against Ukrainians in the international information space. And it really astonishes me as what we are seeing today, how carefully, surgically carefully, these trolls have been targeting Western citizens in order to turn them into Putinist zombies, thinking, for example, these are examples from my journalistic investigations, that Nazis and fascists started the war against Ukraine back in 2014, when it was, of course, Russia. Then also the Kiev regime is fascist junta, Then MH17 was shot down by Ukrainians. All these types of conspiracy theories, dehumanizing, just like Markus said, and demonizing the Ukrainian people, seriously also against Finnish people, but not just them. And of course, I was then being attacked myself, just like Markus described. I have been made the target of both Russian and Finnish fake news for my investigations, because this has been seriously the topic that the Russians been just obsessed to close down. Discussions about what Russia is doing against Ukraine, how Russia is waging information warfare. This is the topic that Russia does not want you to hear about or to see about or to read about. So that's why we're all made targets. And I'm really happy that we are now today openly confronting this topic and sharing awareness. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for being so brave. I mean, she's understated the threats that she faced in the media. It was years of really, I mean, I would say sort of violent narratives that were being produced, and yet Jessica's continued to stand up and fight for what's right and fight back against the trolls. So, Jessica, thank you so much for all the work that you continue doing despite all these obvious threats. Our next speaker, Patrick Oksanen, has also faced these sorts of threats, and thankfully, when I was going through my experience, I had Patrick, who I could call upon, and he helped me through that trying time, and he's been doing so much work to defend our Swedish democracy and democracy in general as well. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'm going to start with that when you bring it up, because I think it's really important when you are attacked, like you were, that you realize it's not about you, and you're not alone. So that is why it's so important to have the network, that people seeing what's happening to you, reaching out to you, telling you it's nothing wrong with you, etc., and that you feel a strength in the pattern that you're not alone. I think that's really important. And Jessica here has done a huge work on bringing this up on a global level. If we're going to talk about comparison, I would say that these kinds of attack could be, you could make them described as perhaps sniper attacks, because they are targeting one person, trying to get one person out of the debate. When you're talking about huge, massive trolls spreading things very bluntly on the internet, that perhaps is something like a division attack or something like that. But then you have more specialized attacks targeting certain people or groups. And sometimes the information is not totally false, but you put an angle on it and change the debate. So you have in this information warfare different tactics applied. And I think that is one thing to bring with you in understanding. But the thing I was actually going to talk about is to put it on a larger scale, because we are in a time when authoritarian states stands against democracies. That is the overall global conflict right now. And sorry to say it, but we are not doing very well in the democratic world. We are now back on the levels, in global levels on democracy, back that we were in 1990, according to index from political scientists at Gothenburg University. So we have seen a reversed trend globally that democracies are losing their ground. So it is very important to understand this is a global issue, and also that the authoritarian states and authoritarian forces are combining themselves in a way that builds a big ecosystem of information, of disinformation, of swamp, so to speak. And here is China an actor that we should not forget, because China is enhancing the Russian information, the disinformation. We have seen it in COVID-19, we've seen it now in Ukraine, how China is spreading the Russian version of it. So we are in a very tough situation globally to understand this, even if we think now in Western democracies that Russia's information warfare has not been successful when it comes to this phase of the information war after the 24th of February. We can talk more about that in detail. But we must look at the global level, and then we see a different story in countries like India or on the African continent or in Latin America, where they do not support Ukraine as we do. So on the global battle, I wouldn't say that the Russian information warfare has failed, but it has failed in the Western society. And that is important to keep in mind.
You're absolutely right. In China, where Russia has been pushed out, so Russia today, for instance, in Canada, has been pulled off the airwaves. Chinese state media has stepped in to fill in that gap and is very much amplifying those Russian narratives right now. And as you point out, in the Southern Hemisphere, in South America, and certainly in Africa, Russia is very successful in promoting its version of what's happening in Ukraine, and it's getting, you can see the support in places like the UN. Hanna Lubakova, you have been fighting the Lukashenko regime. You're an independent journalist and fighting the regime for the past years. You're living in exile right now. What's your view on how disinformation is how Lukashenko is using disinformation and how Putin is using it against the Belarusian people?
All right. So, Marcus, you actually in the beginning you mentioned 1984. You quoted the book. So, just for information, 1984 was banned in Belarus, and this is so absurd, but this is also true. And last year, this was one of the most sort of popular books, best-selling books in Belarus. So the regime got so scared of that it even attempted to ban it. I think Lukashenko, the regime in Belarus, brought these transnational repressions into a new level. We know that last year the Ryanair plane was forced down in Minsk. An athlete was attempted to there was an attempt to kidnap an athlete in Japan, in Tokyo. So it's all done to provoke fear, to scare us, to scare dissidents who are abroad, to show that, our hand can actually take you. We are so, experienced, we are so powerful, and we can get to you wherever you live. Of course, it created a lot of fear among us, among dissidents who are abroad, but I would say that, there is no choice, right? We have to, we are at least in a safer situation, in a safer country than people in Belarus. Regarding propaganda of the regime in Russia, I noticed that I've been still looking for some logic, and I assume that many of you are also trying to find it in what Russians are saying or in what the regime is saying. To kind of, how is that possible? Like, how are they kind of able to spread that? For us, it's so black and white, what's happening in Ukraine, but this is not the case, as Patrick explained, and I totally agree that in China or in Brazil or in South Africa or in India, that would be a completely different situation. They don't see the war in the same way as we do, and this is because of the of another narrative of different messages that their internet has. Because this is not only Western internet, we are used to it, there are several internets. There is one in the West, there is one in China, completely unfree, censored, controlled, and there are sort of not free internets in Russia, in Belarus, in India, and in several other countries. The Economist Intelligence Unit actually said that 2/3 of the world's population sort of either neutral towards the war or support Russia in the war. So we are not actually the majority, and this is scary. In Belarus, sort of what's happening now, basically, the regime's propaganda, state media, they copycat, they mirror Russian propaganda, Russian narratives, and they completely repeat them. Ukrainians are bombing themselves, these banderivцы, neo-Nazis, Ukrainians, are basically killing civilians. Putin is almighty, Putin is so powerful. this is all Russian propaganda that is being basically now repeated in Belarus. And I would say that now Belarus has lost its sovereignty in the information sphere, because we don't have our own narratives. We copy those from Russia, with this difference that Lukashenko is presented there as a cool guy, as a tough guy, you know, peacemaker, pigeon of peace, who is basically resolving the crisis and so on. So that's the only difference between those two sort of narratives, those two propagandas. It's not, the situation in Belarus is not yet catastrophic, because there is a lot of distrust in state media, in pro-government media. We see that the majority of the population in Belarus is against the Belarus participation in the war. They don't accept that. And this is also the case not only for opposition, like for activists, pro-democracy activists, but also for Lukashenko's loyalists. They're also against that, and Lukashenko sees that, and Putin also sees that. But because of the media blackout, this is getting more and more dangerous. We have seen not only repressions against journalists like myself, but also the attempt of the regime to destroy every organization, to destroy institutions. And this is the institutional vacuum that Lukashenko is creating in Belarus is very dangerous, again, because we don't see, there is no alternative. And people are, sorry to say that, lazy, very often to look for alternative information, right? Because, well, you need to install VPN, you need to circumvent censorship, you need to get to these websites, you know, find this information. And if you look for it, you can be jailed because it's delegalized and so on. So there are so many obstacles for people in Belarus, and they are willing to look for this information, to seek alternative information, but it's very hard. With the closure of several important, most popular media outlets, such as Tut.by, in Belarus, people were left without basically most sort of important, powerful sources. And where did they go? They got politicized because the war politicizes people. They need to get information from somewhere, and they have nowhere to go. Now we see that there are at least 30% of the population who watch state TV. Some 20% would trust it, which is quite a low level. But again, because of this constant propaganda, because of a media blackout, this might change. And I'm not naive, and I'm not very optimistic, I would say, about that status quo. I think that more needs to be done, and hopefully we will talk about that. But yeah, the situation now is not catastrophic, but it might be.
Well, thank you for that, Hanna. Yeah, let's get right into what we need to do about it. But and Jessica, you want to jump in right now? Jessica, go ahead.
Yes, please. Thank you so much, Patrick and Hanna, for your presentations. I would like to echo on something that Patrick said about the global situation of democracy being taken down gradually. And just today, I made a list of operations, just really quickly, in between just another panel, actually, of political events in which Russian trolls have been found to try and influence and impact or fuel or agitate or in some other means participate in order to destroy basically democracy. And I will just give you quickly this list so to see that this is a global problem where the Russian trolls are a driving force of authoritarian regimes and regime changes. So, for example, everyone knows US elections 2016, they were pushing for Trump as the president of United States. French election, this I had troubles remember, maybe 2017, when Russian trolls tried to hack Macron's campaign emails, trying to do the same as they had already done to Hillary Clinton's campaign earlier. Also maybe 2017-ish, German election, they were promoting AFP, so the far-right party. Also hacking and trolling in order to mess up with the MH17 investigation and how the world perceived MH17, the flight, Malaysian plane shot down by Russian intelligence officers in eastern Ukraine back in 2014. The Russian trolls were claiming and still claim it was Ukrainians who shot it down. Ongoing campaign of anti-NATO trolling as well as protest organizing in different countries. They are just participating in and organizing and fueling protests that are attacking the institutions in the West. African American nation state, they are building, like Patrick mentioned, operations in African continent. They want to actually break down USA, and they're fueling a sentiment of California becoming independent, for example. Helping dictator in Sudan to oppress citizen protests with fake news on social media. Trolling against NATO membership of many countries, and of course there's the Blame Ukraine campaign that is ongoing, but just to name a few.
Thank you for that, Jessica. And you bring up the secessionists in California. There was a similar movement in Canada, a Western separatist movement that Sputnik was supporting. That Sputnik was giving a voice to some of those that were calling for Western separation in Canada. And just one point that I picked up from Patrick when he said earlier that this Russian disinformation doesn't seem to be working. I would agree. Wholesale, it doesn't seem to be affecting Western societies, but there are the fringe left, right, and elements that are picking this up. We have someone on Fox News in the United States, someone named Tucker Carlson, who has been repeating Russian narratives about Ukraine for the past 3 months. On the far left, we have individuals and groups and media platforms that are picking up those same narratives that Ukraine is a country run by neo-Nazis, that all Central Eastern Europeans, Estonians included, are neo-Nazis. And in fact, just during the start of the war, there was a rally in Toronto where Chrystia Freeland, our deputy prime minister, who's of Ukrainian background, there was a march to the center of the city, and someone superimposed a red and black scarf in front of her. Red and black is, of course, the colors of the World War II resistance in Ukraine. A photo was taken, posted to Twitter, and the far right and the far left in Canada, the media, picked up on this and said, see, the earlier reports were right, Chrystia Freeland is in fact a Nazi. So there is this threat of the long-term effect of the disinformation that I'm really concerned about. So
we can take a historical example of that. You have Operation Infection, the operation that was conducted by KGB and that said that HIV was originated Fort Detrick in Maryland back in the 80s. And it was an operation that started first planted into publication, I think it was in India, and spread around the world. And back in, I think it was 86 or 87, Gorbachev shut the operation down. But still, today, there are Americans believing that, especially black Americans, believing that HIV comes from the American military. And it was constructed to hit black people in the US. So I mean, the pestilence of disinformation can live on for a very, very long time, and they have effect.
Right, and they've actually been promoting vaccine hesitancy in general already for the past decade. First of all, you know, for children and polio vaccines, and when COVID came along, that was fertile ground for these Russian information warriors to further polarize us.
Yeah, and we've seen in COVID again Fort Detrick in Maryland been pointed out as the place of origin. So you're reusing it. And the same thing was with SARS, Fort Maryland Detrick. So actually they are not inventing the stories, they are reusing the stories. And then it hits a strike of similarity because, oh yeah, the Americans, they do dirty stuff. Wasn't it something with HIV there in Fort Detrick in Maryland? Oh yeah, it must be COVID that comes from there as well. So you can see how this is going on and going on and going on. And our mind works like if you repeat something enough, so many times enough, you will start to at least consider it to be true.
So those cognitive barriers, the natural ones that we would have, which would sort of make us think twice about these headlines when we see them, they're just worn down. And then all of those, you know, conspiracy theories about microchips being injected into us, it becomes that much easier for us, for these authoritarians and conspiracy theorists to push them into our brains.
Yeah. But you know that after your third shot, you get the NATO membership. It works out for Sweden and Finland.
Well done, well done. Now, you know, I think that in the Western world, at least, we have these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and such. which have really been used and exploited by these authoritarians, and certainly the Russian state, the trolls that Jessica has investigated. They've exploited them to access a very large Western audiences. You mentioned the Ryanair hijacking when Roman Protasevich was pulled off there. Belarusian state media, which was on YouTube, actually broadcast his confession video. This is a forced confession. YouTube broadcast this. It allowed the Belarusian state media to broadcast this. Not only that, but they placed advertisements on there, and so they actually generated revenues from this. So, if we're going to move forward, if we're going to fight the trolls, if we're going to fight Lukashenko, how do we go forward? Social media has a role to play, governments have a role to play, civil society has a role to play. You've all thought about this, certainly media and journalists. What are your thoughts? How can we combat this? And I don't know, Hanna, do you want to go first?
Yeah, let's all focus on Belarus and how to fight with Lukashenko. It's totally fine. Yeah, everybody is welcome to suggest, No, actually, regarding Roman, I think that there has been a lot of, many things happened since the plane was forced down. Now, for the regime to destroy people's reputation, people's life means nothing. After, as you know, Roman Protasevich was traveled with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend was also arrested. So when she was sentenced to 6 years in prison, on the next day, Roman allegedly announced that he got married. And everybody criticized him because of that, and basically people are saying that, well, how could he do that? On the next day when she was sentenced. But I think it was done. I cannot even imagine. He's under house arrest. How was he able to meet this woman and marry her at all? So I think it was just done by the regime to destroy sort of his reputation, but also to stop us being empathetic towards him. To forget about this Ryanair case. Roman is a hostage. Whatever he does or says on TV, I don't believe in that, and I ask everybody else not to believe in that and not consider his words as serious. I know him. I don't believe that he changed his mind just on the next day when he got arrested regarding Lukashenko, and he said many compliments towards him. So what can be done? Markus, you mentioned these ads on YouTube, and that's actually a big issue. So, as you know, prisoners in Belarus detainees were tortured. So there were ads showing people being tied to their chairs and basically saying these confessions. And these confessions, these kind of short videos, were published as ads ordered by those pro-government channels in Belarus. So basically, the regime paid YouTube to post this advertising on their platform, and this just shows that this content is not moderated, and we can watch, on YouTube whatever the regime wants us to watch. We raised this issue several times, so several ads were sort of took down, but this continues, and they just repeat this again and again. Information is important because that was basically one of the reasons for the revolution in Belarus. Because of COVID, when people got real information from bloggers, from journalists, they knew that, well, the situation is different, actually, that what Lukashenko described. And they trusted also independent journalists. In 2020, we were able to monopolize the information sphere. And this created this effect, this snowball effect, when people saw that so many people were protesting, they wanted to join, they wanted to kind of be part of that. And they also understood that there are so many of them. And that was because of media, that was because of social media as well. So investing in information, this is not just charity, this is not just, something we would do for nothing just because we have to, but this is actually our fight for a safer future, for a safer Europe, because we see that Lukashenko now, he not only forced down the plane, but he also helped launch the war, and he this is because of him that Bucha, Irpin, and other places in Ukraine were attacked, and Kiev was also attacked from the territory of Belarus, right, by missiles and so on. So fighting with Lukashenko is not he's not just a sort of local Belarusian problem. He is a problem for our continent.
Well, and I would add that I think one of the ways that we can push back and go on the offensive is to support journalists like Hanna and the platforms that she writes for and other civil society organizations. We don't do enough of that. Thankfully, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have really taken the lead very much in supporting those civil society organizations, protecting those activists and giving them a home. But I think certainly in the Western world, we need to do much, much, much more of that. Jessica.
Yes, completely, you're right. And as soon as I started to investigate the Russian trolls and their impact in real people, I found out that they were already back then, these Russian trolls, exploiting the social media channels and platforms, and in a really skilled and thoughtful manner. Actually, you have to give them some credit. They were actually using cross-media methods in order to make their messages, for example, portraying Ukraine as the aggressor in the war that Russia was actually waging, through Twitter bots as well as Facebook accounts, into over 2 million viewers in just a couple of days. Also, RT, Russia's channel of international global information warfare, as well as its subsidiary Raptly, are super savvy when it comes to spreading their content on social media, and they insert this entertaining, funny, interesting, cute, emotion-provoking, non-political content too, but then they also have this constant narrative of attacking basically us with their content. So I have tried to have the governments view social media channels as enablers of these Russian trolls, and basically it's Russian security services. It's not even the trolls, but it's the security services who are designing these operations, and trolls are just conducting them behind or after following those security services orders. So at the moment, these social media channels are posing national security threats, as well as threats of constant criminal campaigns against various countries and various countries' children who are also using these social media channels, but still they're not regulated well enough. Also, I have personally visited the headquarters of YouTube/Google, Facebook, as well as Twitter, together with other victims of disinformation and criminal activity on social media. And we have just laid it all out there for the executives to weigh and think what to do about it. And there have been just tears in their eyes, but they have still done nothing to it. So that's not the problem.
Patrick, Vladimir Putin changed the constitution of his own country just last summer. He's going to be around until at least 2036. Information war works for him. It's cheap. It's going to continue. What are we going to do about it? What's Sweden doing about it?
Well, it's not only him. We see the Chinese do it. And you have Oxford Institute that measures the digital manipulation around the globe. And the number of countries they find these methods in are just increasing and increasing and increasing. So, I mean, this goes beyond Vladimir Putin. What Sweden is doing about it, we have an authority from January 1st, and a renewed branch of the government. We had it before, and then we scrapped it, and now we have taken it back, and that's an agency of psychological defense. Sweden is one of the few countries that have an idea of psychological defense as a part of the total defense concept. So that branch is back on business again, and so that is one thing that we're doing concrete. But I think we must understand that the enemy is using a broad information toolbox, and it's a combination of their state channels, their combination of social media operations, also cyber attacks. and also manipulation of our information system, like buying into the larger international news bureaus, where Stockholm Free World Forum published a report in December about how China has paid content, TV content, to larger news bureaus, and by that changing the debate about China globally, because you can get some nice pandas or some taikonauts or and so on, and you put that in your TV show in the end of the program, instead of perhaps reporting about the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province. So we need to see the complexity of it, and when to be about what we're going to do about it, then we must see that we must understand what is at stake, and then we must realize that they don't have media. They are information weapons, and we should not treat them as media. RT, the Chinese television, and so on. And we should go after our own media very hard when we pretend in media that they are media, because they are not. And I think it's an abomination that you have them in Reuters and AP and so on, and that should just be gone. But they are also very skillful on playing on our needs for stories. I mean, we quote this horrible stories, like when you have Protasevich saying that he's been doing bad stuff, forced convictions. We are quoting that, and we shouldn't quote it like that. And we have another example in Swedish media, which I think was horrible. The headline from Lukashenko, I'm sleepless during the night because of the situation of the migrants in Belarus and border. Who the hell believes that Lukashenko is sleepless over the hybrid warfare that he is conducting? Well, that is bullocks. But it was quoted from the Belarusian propaganda into Western media. And I think that is, well, we are basically taking a gun and shooting ourselves in the foot sometimes, and we should just quit doing that.
Yes. Could we get you to Canada to tell the government that as well? And
yeah,
media?
No problem.
Great.
When do you need me?
We'll get you there in the fall. I'm mindful of the time. We're very close to the end of this session. We have about 8 minutes. Are there questions from the floor? Anyone? We'll go to the gentleman. Oh, wait, let's wait for a microphone. Are we going to have a microphone? Yeah. Okay.
So Jessica has a chance to hear.
So we'll take two questions at the same time.
My name is Åke Zetterman. Actually, my question goes to Jessica, because having read her book, your book, I'm curious about.
Well, let me ask you, Jessica, can you hear the question?
Can you hear this? Jessica, do you hear me? Okay.
I'll try to repeat it.
Okay, I'll try again. I have a question on your book, and what has happened to Mr. Beckman? How is he working, and what is his role in Finland these days? That is of interest to me. Thank you.
A very good
Thanks so much.
question.
Very interestingly, Juha Beckman has been the representative of Russian Institute of Strategic Studies, which is supervised by Russian intelligence officers, representing FSB, GRU, as well as SVR. And they are appointed by Putin himself. So it's Putin's think tank that has, for example, designed the hacking and trolling operation against the US election 2016. So he went after me heavily back in 2014 and continued. He has been convicted in Supreme Court early this year for stalking me. But how he's doing nowadays, he has his own YouTube program called something like Saturday. So he's trolling for Russia, trolling for Russian war. He's spreading war propaganda, also using Twitter in it. He has changed his Twitter handler to Docenti. So it's just trolling the hell out of everyone in Finland. Luckily nowadays people see through him and also give him feedback, but I don't understand what leaves him there, just spreading these outraged lies. But you know what? The anonymous attacked his campaign some time ago.
So those of you who don't know who Johan Backman is, he's a Finnish professor who has been actively working to advance Russian narratives, the denial of the occupation of the Baltic states since, correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica, around 2011, 2012? Maybe a bit before that? Something like that.
He was active already during the Bronze Soldier clashes.
Right.
He was agitating them too in Estonia.
Right.
And he is a persona non grata in Estonia.
That's right, thankfully. The gentleman here in the front with the Free Belarus.
Yes, Dmitry Wasserman, People's Embassy of Belarus in Sweden. Let me first give a short statement because Hanna touched upon one important subject. We actually invest in generating, producing objective information, use, Radio Freedom, Swedish Radio, it's Deutsche Welle, etc. But we are probably not investing enough into making this information available and deliver this information. And there are possible technical solutions for this. So just want to emphasize that it must be important subject that people who working with information and disinformation should think about. But this is not my question. My question is about, we have been spoken about trolls a lot, but there is another component of information war, and there we're talking about so-called Schröderization, when Kremlin have their assets in higher political echelons. How much do we know about it? And do we have good preparedness now in Europe to cope with this Schröderization?
Who would like to take that one first? Patrick?
All right. Well, I think Germany is learning a lesson right now, and Schröder's reputation is dead in Germany. So I think there is learning, but here you have differences in geography. I mean, situation is worse in countries like Austria, Italy, than in for example Sweden. So I think also that we have been a bit afraid about talking about this because they hit back very hard, because there is also a system of attacking those pointing out the problems with it. For example, libels and so on. And Great Britain has, for example, a system that makes it very hard to go to. It's easy to go to court trying to silence someone who's pointing about bad connections. And sometimes it's also hard to prove it very thoroughly that someone is bought. It tends to get to a chain of incidents or so on. So that is the problematic in it. But I think we're in a much better place today than we were 5 years ago on this issue.
I unfortunately have to cut you here. There is never enough time. So let's give a round of applause to our panel here.
Well, thank you for doing that difficult task.
That was strict. You have 1 minute.
Yeah, I'm aware. It's just that we have our final remarks and it's going to take a bit of time. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
We didn't get to use the last 30 seconds.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Hanna. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
It's tough being a moderator. You're always the bad guy. But Alina Subkovic, I would like you here on stage. I'm going to present her before we start. She's a member of the Ukraine Nordic Forum, and she has a PhD in social science, and she's a scholar on contemporary Ukraine, and she's going to give us her final remarks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today, and I see a lot of symbolism in what is happening. We are having the conference called Stand with Ukraine. It's been organized by the Estonian organizations, and it takes place in the Europe House. It's very symbolic for me, and I believe in the symbolism. And I need to mention that today's the 100 days of Ukraine's brave resistance. And what we have talked today, we see that when evil is not punished, it remains and it returns, it is strong. So the only way to have the secure Europe is to support Ukraine in its victory. Because, as we have heard, Russian crimes do not appear out of the blue. They are the result of systemic worldview and repeating methodologies. It's also the colonial war, and we were talking about this today as well. The Russia-Ukraine war today is not only about defining the future we'll be living in, but also on the redefining the past. And we will witness a lot of discussions the upcoming years on the Second World War, on the deportation, on the question of the refugee communities in their building new continents and cultures. And the war of this magnitude will have a lot of consequences and unpredictabilities as well. Hunger in African continent if the Black Sea area is not liberated, but also shifts in all sorts of preferences, political, psychological, in consumption, in economics, and also greater geopolitical shifts with the possibility of emergence of new regions and global leaders. Will it be new forms of intermarium between Baltic and Black Sea, or maybe the broad Nordic-Ukraine association? I would like to remind that, for example, the Kievan Rus, the medieval Ukrainian state, was ruled by Vikings and Kiev political elites. Quite unexpected unity. Or another quite unexpected ally of Karl XII and Ukrainian hetman Ivan Mazepa. Unexpected, but yet it was there. So I think that it's not the territorial location that defines the allies, but similarity of certain values and that enlighten the common path. The coming years will be overly complex, and genocide and mass violence that we witness today in Ukraine is only one form of these upcoming complexities. But such times in particular require the strong friendship and trust and common vision of the future. So I'm immensely grateful to Estonian World Council and Association of Estonians in Sweden, all the speakers and dear audience for making this all happen. This meeting today made me feel strong that such friendship exists, and despite all the sorrows and difficulties of our times, we will go through all of this and build the common future we want to live in. Thank you very much.
And our last speaker, Reet Martin-Seer, member of the board on the Foreign Affairs Committee and on the Estonian World Council, and a vice president of the Estonian Central Council in Canada. The floor is yours.
Thank you. As chair of the organizing committee, it's my honor to give a few closing remarks and thank all of you who have made this day possible. And as you can see from my scribbles, I heard so many great ideas that I just kept writing and crossing out and then writing and crossing out, and I can't possibly say everything that we heard. So I'll try to summarize as best as I can. It certainly has been a highly informative and thought-provoking conference and afternoon, I think, for all of us. And the topics for the day, as we do stand here together with Ukraine, are tightly interwoven, from the historical Russian aggression in the region, in Europe, to what is happening today with Russia's horrific war against Ukraine. from the disinformation that hides the truth from the Russian people and continues to feed the war, to the consequences of these actions, one of which is positive, Sweden and Finland's sudden move to join NATO. And the roots, of course, of today's conflict lie in Russia's fear of democracy in Ukraine and ultimately Putin's fear of losing power and what the subsequent consequences might be for him. Russia's actions today, as we know and we have heard, follow the same playbook that we have seen before over and over and over in the Baltics and elsewhere in Europe with the Soviet Union. When they portrayed themselves as liberators and the countries they were invading as being infested with Nazis. Because there were no consequences for their crimes when the collapse of the Soviet Union came about, occupations of Georgia, Transnistria, Crimea, and the Donbass have all been made possible, and now, of course, the war in Ukraine. And we have heard that this must stop. As Dr. Andrew Kiena, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, stated, Putin's ultimate goal is the destabilization of all of Europe. And as reiterated by several of today's speakers, February 24th, 2022 was a turning point in European and world history. It was unimaginable before that date that Finland and Sweden would join NATO, at least not in the short term, and yet here we are today. One of the things that has also been talked about today is Western unity, which of course must continue. The US under President Biden has played a key role in building this unity, and of course the Baltic countries with Estonia in the forefront and their Prime Minister also doing a wonderful, amazing job. I have to put in a plug for Estonia, of course, has played a leading role in really keeping the world's attention on this and also in keeping the countries unified. A question was asked about what might happen in 2024 should Donald Trump win again. And of course, we don't know. Marko Mihkelson underscored the importance of supporting the EU candidacy of Ukraine, and it was emphasized by many that NATO's doors must be open to all who wish to join. And we also heard about the importance of diplomacy in ensuring that this happens. We heard a brilliant overview of information warfare that Putin has launched, essentially against democracy around the world, which has been building over the past 2 decades, and its long-term effects. We heard about the different ways in which individuals and groups are attacked, how a swamp of disinformation has been created, what it looks like on a global level, and including the role of China. A key message was that we should not treat disinformation networks as media, but for what they actually are. I certainly hope that Rupert Murdoch was listening to your comment, Patrick Oksanen, when you made this with his Fox News channel. We have heard the Belarusian perspective, which is so important to hear and which we must not forget. At the start of the conference, Karin Karlsbro stated her hope to see a focus on the future as well as the past and the present in today's conference. So what does the future hold? As we are all aware, some Western leaders are proposing an end to the war by means of a saving face measure for Putin. We know, those of us who are here today, that this cannot be allowed to happen. Nothing can be decided without Ukraine. The question for all of us, I suppose, is one of resilience, or what is the amount of pain that the West is willing to endure for democracy? One thing is clear, and we've heard that from our speakers, that to avoid history from repeating over and over and over again, Russia must lose and be made to pay for its actions. We finally heard very moving words from Alina Zubkovcha. No, please say it. Zubkovic, thank you. From the Nordic Ukraine Forum. And I do want to assure you that at least in Canada, we stand very strongly with a very, very strong Ukrainian population, and we are united, and we obviously are here today because of you and the suffering your country is facing. It's now my distinct honor to thank everyone who has contributed to the success of today's conference. First of all, I'd like to thank the audience for being here. It is you, the audience, who make the conference. And thank you for enlivening our discussions with your questions. Thank you to our partners who made this event possible. Swedish thank you. Member of European Parliament, Karin Karlsbro, who so graciously has provided these rooms for us today at Europe House, and what a lovely venue this is. Stockholm Free World Forum, NGO Global Estonians, the Association of Estonians in Sweden, OREL, Ruotsi-eestlaste Liit, and of course the main organizer, the Estonian World Council, YEKN. A special thank you goes to the Estonian Embassy in Sweden with Ambassador Margus Kolga, not Markus Kolga, there's two of them, for his invaluable assistance in bringing all of this together. And thank you to all the members of the Estonian World Council Foreign Affairs Committee. We met, I don't know how many times over the last few months to pull this together, so thank you to all of you. And a special thank you to Sirla Sört for her vision, her incredible energy, and the countless hours. Often I would be texting her from Canada thinking she would be asleep. It's 3 a.m. and she's doing something. She has spent so much time preparing for today, and we really owe her a huge thank you. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Sirla. Most of all, thank you to our esteemed speakers, presenters, our politicians, diplomats, journalists, human rights activists, and all of you who have joined us today and helped to make us all smarter. I would now like to call upon all of the speakers and panelists who are still with us. When I call your name, if you could come up so that we can present you with a book as a token of our appreciation. And first, I'd like to call upon the author of the book, Urve Tamberg, an Estonian-Canadian writer and a member of Estonian Central Council in Canada and one of our delegates to the Estonian World Council, who will say a few words about her book. And I think because it's historical fiction, it sort of brings us full circle to where we started today. So Urve, and do you want Sonia? Is she still here? Oh, Sonia's recording.
She's my photographer.
No, I was going to give it.
Sorry, I will just say a couple of words because it's 5 o'clock. But I'm very honored that to present the book. It's truly an honor to share the story with you. I'm a historical fiction writer, and the reason I write historical fiction is because I really didn't like history. And I didn't like history because it was about dates and facts, and it wasn't about people and what they do and how they feel. And I don't really want to quote Stalin, but I will. He said that one death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic. And I think we have to remember that. It's the one. We have to remember the stories. We have to remember every single person that suffered under any kind of totalitarian regime and Stalin and Hitler. So I'm very honored that I can share the story, and it is based on some of my family history, the stories that I kind of listened to when I was a teenager because I didn't actually listen to my parents, and then also a lot of research. So because if it's wrong, then somebody Estonian is going to come and find me and tell me it's wrong. So if there are any errors, please let me know. So far, so good.
Okay. So I will call you by name and thank each of you individually. When I call your name, that is also the thank you. And if you are here, please do come up. If you are no longer here, we will try to get these to you wherever you are. So Aho Rebas, who was our first speaker from the Estonian World Council, our president, our leader. Oh. As usual, authors don't publicize their books well. The Darkest Corner of the World. Yes, and it takes place in Hiiumaa and Tallinn. It does, yeah. In the early 1940s. She's a really good publicist. Is Karin Karlsbro still with us? Yes, there she is. Thank you so much. Aho Rebas. Come in and read some historical fiction, and don't be too harsh. Thank you, Hain. Martin Kragh, I believe, left? Yeah. Yes, he did. Is Gunnar Hökmark still here? No. He's also left. Björn was not with us in person. Judith Gah, is she still here? No. We should have done this like earlier, twice. Oh, they did get it. Okay. The next person who is here and was with us is Marko Mikkelsson. Thank you, Marko. Alexandra Ivanov. Markus Kolga is still here, I believe. Yes. Thank you, Markus. And I told Patrick Oksanen not to leave, so he's still here.
Now you're very curious what we were.
Yes. Oh, okay. We'll have to send Jessica Otto one. Hanna Lubakova. Oops, sorry. We danced. And thank you, Alina Zubkovic. I think that the Söt family should also receive one. Sirle and Nora, if you could both come up, mother and daughter. I think we'll give you one. That's it. Oh, two. Okay, we have extras. We can give you two. And did I miss anyone? I guess the last one is up for purchase then. Okay, so once again, thank you, Urve. Thank you for writing the book. I do recommend it. And for those of you for whom English is not a first language, it's actually written for an older teenage audience, like I think 15 to 18-year-olds. And I did it as a read aloud to 3 of my granddaughters who were between the ages of 9 to 12. I did change out a few scenes, but that I thought were a little bit too mature for them. But it's not a difficult read, and I think you will really enjoy it and learn a lot. And it really does tell a story, and it's those stories that we really need to keep alive, and we need to keep going. And you know, the media, all of us have a role to play in telling those stories and to keep telling them. So thank you again for all of you who have participated today. And I'd just like to say, Slava Ukrainia.